The fire pit at the center of Blackwood territory roared high that night, throwing orange light against 300 watching faces, and Elena Voss stood alone in the middle of that circle, with her hands shaking at her sides. She had known something was wrong, the moment the pack elders called for a full gathering without explanation. She had known it more when Damien Cross, the Alpha heir, refused to look at her as she walked to the center stone. Now she understood everything. This was not a celebration. This was an execution of her place in the pack, carried out in front of everyone who had ever called her family. "Damien!" Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Please tell me what is happening." He stood a few feet away, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the black formal coat reserved for pack announcements. His jaw was tight. His eyes, when they finally met hers, held nothing warm in them at all. "I am ending the mate bond," he said, loud enough for the whole circle to hear. "Publicly. Tonight." A murmur rolled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Elena felt her knees threaten to give out beneath her. The bond between them had formed 3 years earlier, an invisible thread that every wolf in the territory could sense, tying the future Alpha to an Omega girl nobody respected. She had never asked for it. She had spent 3 years being told by pack elders that she was lucky it existed at all, that a nothing like her had been chosen by fate to stand beside greatness. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, stepping closer, forgetting the eyes on them. "Whatever they told you about me, it isn't true." Damien's expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened further, like a door being bolted shut. "An Omega cannot lead beside an Alpha," he said. "You have no strength, no pack instinct worth speaking of, no bloodline that matters. I will not tie the future of this territory to someone who contributes nothing to it. You are a weight I am not willing to carry any longer." The words landed like physical blows. Elena had been called weak before, had been pushed to the back of training lines, and left off hunting parties for as long as she could remember. She had absorbed insults quietly for years, because that was what Omegas were taught to do. But hearing it from him, in front of everyone, with that particular flatness in his voice, was different. It was final. "Say something," a voice hissed from the crowd. She recognized it as Garrick, the pack's senior elder, standing near Damien's shoulder, with his arms folded, and a look of satisfaction he did nothing to hide. "Tell her the rest, Alpha." Damien's throat moved as he swallowed. For one brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something that almost looked like hesitation. Then it vanished. "You are cast out," he said. "Effective tonight. You no longer belong to Blackwood territory. Your name is struck from the pack registry. You have until sunrise to leave these lands." The silence that followed was worse than any shout. Elena looked around the circle, searching desperately for one face that might object, one voice that might rise up and say this was wrong. She found nothing but lowered eyes and turned shoulders. Even the few people she had once called friends stared at the ground rather than meet her gaze. Fear of the Alpha's judgment ran deeper than loyalty to an Omega girl nobody thought mattered. 7 years, Elena said quietly, almost to herself. "I have lived here 7 years, Damien. I have never once asked you for anything." "Then this should be easy for you," he answered, and the cruelty in it, delivered so calmly, told her he had already made peace with what he was doing. Whatever pulled at him internally, whatever doubt might have lived somewhere beneath that composed exterior, he had buried it deep enough that it no longer reached the surface. Garrick stepped forward then, savoring the moment with an expression Elena would remember for years afterward. "The girl was always a mistake," he announced to the crowd, though his eyes stayed fixed on her. "A weak bloodline, thin blood, no gift worth speaking of. The Alpha is finally seeing clearly." Elena wanted to argue. She wanted to demand proof, demand a reason beyond vague insults about bloodlines and weakness. But something in Garrick's satisfaction, in the particular delight he took in watching her unravel, planted a small, cold seed of suspicion in her mind. He looked less like a man witnessing justice, and more like a man watching a plan finally come together. There was no time to examine the feeling. 2 pack guards were already stepping toward her, ready to escort her from the gathering ground, ready to make certain she understood the order was not a suggestion. "I can walk myself out," she said, lifting her chin, refusing to let them touch her. It was the only defiance available to her, the only scrap of dignity she had left to claim. She turned from the fire, from Damien, from every face that had once been familiar, and was now simply another wall closing her out, and she walked toward the tree line without looking back. Behind her, she heard Damien's voice rise once more, addressing the pack, already moving on to some other matter of business, as though the last 5 minutes had been nothing more than a brief interruption. That, more than anything else, told her exactly how little she had ever mattered to him. The forest swallowed her within minutes. The gathering fire shrank to a distant glow behind the trees, then disappeared entirely. Elena kept walking, following no particular path, letting her feet carry her forward, simply because stopping felt like it might break something inside her that would never be repaired. She reached the old creek that marked the edge of Blackwood territory sometime after midnight. The water ran cold and fast over smooth stones, catching threads of moonlight on its surface. She sat on the bank, pulled her knees to her chest, and allowed herself, finally, to cry. She cried for the years she had spent trying to prove her worth to people who had already decided she had none. She cried for the training sessions she had been excluded from, the whispered comments she had pretended not to hear, the quiet, grinding loneliness of being tied by fate to a man who clearly saw her as an embarrassment rather than a partner. She cried until there was nothing left, until her body simply ran out of tears to give. When the crying stopped, something else took its place. It arrived slowly at first, a small ember of anger buried beneath the grief, and then it grew, spreading warmth through her chest, the way the tears never had. She thought about Garrick's satisfaction, the way he had watched her humiliation like a man collecting on a long-held debt. She thought about the strange comments she had heard over the years, elders speaking in hushed voices whenever she entered a room, conversations that stopped abruptly the moment they noticed her presence. She had always assumed it was simple dislike. Now, sitting alone by the creek with nothing left to lose, she wondered if there had been something more deliberate happening around her the entire time. She had no proof of anything. She had no pack, no home, no bond, no name that meant anything beyond the territory she had just been thrown out of. But she had her own 2 legs, her own mind, and a spark of fury that refused to be extinguished no matter how much the night tried to smother it. "I will not stay broken," she said aloud to the empty forest, her voice steadier than she expected. "Whatever they think I am, whatever they made me believe I was, I will become something they cannot explain away." It was not a plan. It was barely even a decision. But it was enough to get her back onto her feet, enough to make her cross the creek and step beyond the boundary stones that marked the edge of everything she had ever known. The human world waited beyond the trees, indifferent and enormous. Elena had visited it only a handful of times, always briefly, always under supervision, always reminded that pack wolves did not belong among ordinary people for longer than necessary. Now it was the only place left for her to go. She walked through the night without stopping, following a paved road that eventually led to the outskirts of a small town. Streetlights buzzed overhead, casting pale yellow circles on empty sidewalks. A gas station sat on the corner, its windows lit, but its lot empty. Elena approached it slowly, aware of how out of place she must look, still dressed in the formal gathering clothes she had worn to what was supposed to be an ordinary pack meeting. Inside, a young clerk barely glanced up from his phone as she entered. She had no money, nothing to buy, nowhere to sleep. She simply stood near the entrance for a moment, absorbing the strange normalcy of fluorescent lights and refrigerated drinks, and a radio playing quietly behind the counter, before stepping back out into the cold. She spent that first night in the shelter of an old bus stop a mile down the road, curled against the plexiglass wall with her knees drawn up to her chest. Watching the sky slowly shift from black to gray, she did not sleep. She simply sat and thought, replaying every moment of the gathering, searching for something she might have missed, some sign she should have caught earlier. By morning, exhaustion had hollowed her out completely, but underneath the exhaustion, that same ember of determination still burned. She stood, brushed the dust from her ruined formal clothes, and began walking toward the center of town with no destination in mind beyond simply moving forward. She did not know yet what her life would become. She did not know that the humiliation of that single night would eventually transform into something far larger than anyone at that gathering fire could have imagined. All she knew, as the sun rose fully over an unfamiliar horizon, was that she was still standing, still breathing, still herself, even after losing everything she had once called home. Behind her, in the heart of Blackwood territory, Damian Cross stood at the window of his private quarters, watching the same sunrise from a very different vantage point. He had not slept either. Something about the previous night's events sat wrong in his chest, a discomfort he could not quite name, and refused to examine too closely. Garrick had been the one to bring him the reports weeks earlier, documents outlining Elena's supposed unsuitability, testimonies from pack members claiming she brought weakness into every gathering she attended, warnings that her continued presence beside him would eventually cost the pack its standing among neighboring territories. Damian had trusted those reports because Garrick had served as an advisor to his father for decades, because questioning an elder's counsel was not something young alphas were taught to do lightly. And yet, standing at that window now, he found himself remembering small things. The way Elena had once stayed up half the night helping an injured pack child fall asleep, despite no one asking her to. The quiet steadiness in her voice whenever conflicts arose between other members. The fact that in 3 years, he had never once seen her raise her voice in anger, even when others treated her poorly in front of him. He pushed the thoughts aside. It was done now. The pack had witnessed the separation. Reversing it would only make him look weak, uncertain, unfit to lead. He told himself this firmly, several times, until the discomfort in his chest quieted enough to be ignored. Miles away, walking down an unfamiliar road under a rising sun, Elena Voss had no way of knowing any of this. She only knew that the life she had built for 7 years was gone, and that whatever came next would be built entirely on her own terms, by her own hands, without anyone's permission. She kept walking. By mid-morning, Elena had reached the center of the small town, a place called Millbrook according to a faded sign bolted to a lamppost. Cars rolled past on a 2-lane street. A bakery on the corner filled the air with the smell of fresh bread, and for a moment, standing outside its window, Elena felt something close to normal life brush against her, close enough to touch but entirely out of reach. She had no money. She had no identification, no phone, nothing but the torn hem of a formal dress that marked her as someone who did not belong among the ordinary people moving briskly along the sidewalk. A woman walking a small dog gave her a curious glance before hurrying past. Elena wrapped her arms around herself and kept moving, unsure of where she was going, but certain that standing still would only invite more attention. She found a public restroom behind the town library and used the sink to wash the dried tears from her face. Her reflection in the cracked mirror looked unfamiliar, hollow-eyed, pale, nothing like the composed young woman who had walked into the gathering circle the night before. She stared at herself for a long moment, searching for some trace of the girl she used to be, and found only exhaustion staring back. "You are still here," she whispered to the reflection. "That counts for something." It did not feel like much, but it was true, and true things mattered more than comforting ones right now. She spent the rest of the day searching for any kind of work, walking from shop to shop along the main street, asking whether anyone needed help with anything at all. Most owners took one look at her disheveled appearance and shook their heads before she had even finished speaking. A diner owner told her flatly that he did not hire people without a fixed address. A hardware store clerk suggested, not unkindly, that she try the shelter 2 towns over. By late afternoon, hunger had settled deep into her stomach, sharp and insistent. She had not eaten since the previous evening, before the gathering, before everything had fallen apart. She sat on a bench outside a small park, watching children play on a set of swings, feeling the distance between their carefree laughter and her own circumstances stretch wider with every passing minute. A man approached her there, older, with kind eyes, and a name tag pinned to his jacket that read Community Outreach. He asked if she needed help, offered directions to a shelter that provided meals and a bed for the night, no questions asked. Elena hesitated, wary of trusting anyone so soon after everything that had happened, but hunger and exhaustion eventually won out over caution. The shelter turned out to be a modest brick building 3 streets over, staffed by a small group of volunteers who moved through their evening routine with practiced efficiency. Elena ate a simple meal of soup and bread at a long communal table, surrounded by strangers who barely looked up from their own plates. Nobody asked where she came from. Nobody questioned the strange clothes she wore or the haunted look in her eyes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was simply another person needing a meal, unremarkable, unnoticed, and there was a strange comfort in that anonymity. That night, lying on a narrow cot in a room shared with a dozen other women, Elena stared at the ceiling and allowed herself to think clearly for the first time since the gathering fire. She thought about Garrick's satisfaction, the strange certainty in his voice as he condemned her in front of the pack. She thought about the years of small cruelties she had absorbed without question, the assumption she had carried her whole life that she simply was not enough, that her Omega status explained every closed door and every dismissive glance. For the first time, she allowed herself to question that assumption directly. What if it had never been true at all? What if someone had built that story around her, brick by brick, year after year, until she believed it herself, without ever being given a reason to doubt it? She had no way to prove anything. She had no allies left in Blackwood territory, no resources, no standing. But she had time now, more time than she knew what to do with, and she had a mind that refused to stop turning the question over and over. The next morning, she left the shelter before sunrise, unable to sleep any longer. Restless with an energy she did not fully understand yet, she walked without direction again, following streets that led further from the town center, past small houses and quiet yards, until the buildings thinned out and gave way to open country road. It was there, walking along the gravel shoulder with the sun barely cresting the horizon, that she first felt it. A prickling awareness along the back of her neck, faint but unmistakable, the kind of sensation every wolf learned to recognize from childhood. She was being watched. Elena stopped walking and turned slowly, scanning the tree line that bordered the road. For a long moment, she saw nothing but swaying branches and shifting morning shadows. Then, near a cluster of pines, she caught the outline of movement, low and deliberate, circling rather than approaching directly. Her heart began to pound. She had no pack behind her now, no allies to call on, no weapons beyond her own two hands. Whatever moved through those trees clearly knew she was alone, and in the world of wolves, alone was the most dangerous thing a person could be. "I know you're there," she called out, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Show yourself, or leave." The movement stopped. Silence stretched between the trees and the road, long enough that Elena began to wonder if she had imagined the entire thing. Then a figure stepped out from the shadows, and she realized her instincts had not deceived her at all. He was tall, older than her by at least 2 decades, with silver threading through dark hair, and a face marked by old scars that told stories she could not begin to guess. He wore simple, practical clothing, nothing like the formal attire of pack elders, and he studied her with an intensity that made her want to step backward, even as her pride kept her feet planted firmly in place. "You walk alone through rogue territory," he said, his voice rough and low. Not a wise choice for someone with no pack scent protecting her. "I did not choose to be alone," Elena answered, lifting her chin despite the tremor in her hands. "It was chosen for me." Something shifted in the stranger's expression at that, a flicker of interest replacing the wary assessment he had worn a moment before. He studied her a while longer, his eyes moving over the torn dress, the exhaustion written plainly across her face, the stubborn set of her jaw that refused to break even now. "Cast out," he said finally, not a question but a statement, as though he had seen the same story play out before in other people, other places. "By your own pack." Elena said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. The stranger's gaze sharpened, taking in details she suspected few others would have noticed, the particular way she held herself despite her exhaustion, the flicker of something powerful buried deep beneath layers of grief and fear. Whatever he saw seemed to settle a decision in his mind. "Most Omegas who lose their pack do not survive a season alone," he said. "The ones who do survive either learn to disappear completely, or they learn to become something their old pack never expected. Which one are you offering to teach me?" Elena asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. A faint, humorless smile crossed the stranger's face. "That depends entirely on what you're willing to become." He turned then, beginning to walk back toward the tree line, pausing only once to glance over his shoulder at her. "The choice is yours. Follow, or continue walking this road alone, until it swallows you whole. I will not ask twice." Elena stood frozen for a moment, every instinct honed by years of caution, screaming at her to stay on the safe, open road, rather than follow a stranger into unfamiliar woods. But another instinct, quieter and newer, whispered that safety had already failed her once, that the life she had been living carefully within the lines had ended in humiliation and abandonment, regardless of how carefully she had followed the rules. She thought of Garrick's satisfied smile. She thought of Damien's flat, final voice, declaring her worthless in front of everyone she had ever known. She thought of the ember of anger still burning quietly in her chest, waiting for something to feed it. Elena took a breath, steadied herself, and stepped off the road into the trees, following the stranger into whatever waited beyond the tree line, uncertain of what she was walking toward, but entirely certain she could not go back to who she had been before. The stranger's camp sat deep within the forest, hidden behind a ridge that made it nearly invisible from any nearby road. It was not the kind of place Elena had expected. No grand lodge, no pack hall, just a weathered cabin, a stone fire pit, and a cleared training yard scattered with worn practice equipment that looked as though it had seen decades of use. "My name is Corvin," the stranger said, leading her toward the cabin without ceremony. "I do not run a pack. I do not offer comfort, and I do not offer sympathy. What I offer is a chance to become strong enough that nobody will ever cast you aside again." Elena studied him carefully, searching for some hidden motive beneath his blunt words, but found only a kind of weary honesty that felt more trustworthy than anything she had encountered in 7 years among Blackwood's polished politics. "Why would you help someone you don't know?" she asked. Corvin paused at the cabin door, considering the question longer than she expected. "Because a very long time ago, someone did the same for me," he said finally. "And because I recognize something in you that most people never notice in themselves until it is far too late to matter." He did not elaborate further, and Elena did not press him. She was too tired, too raw from the previous day's events, to demand answers she was not yet ready to hear. The following weeks tested her in ways she had never imagined possible. Corvin woke her before dawn each morning, pushing her through exercises that left her muscles trembling and her breath ragged. He taught her to move quietly through the trees, to read the subtle signs of danger in shifting shadows and disturbed underbrush, to fight not with brute force, which she did not possess, but with precision and timing, which she gradually began to develop. There were mornings she wanted to quit. There were nights she lay awake on a thin cot inside the cabin, every part of her body aching, wondering whether she had traded one kind of suffering for another. She thought often of Millbrook, of the shelter with its warm soup and unremarkable anonymity, and wondered if she had made a mistake choosing this harder path instead. "You are doing this wrong," Corvin told her one afternoon, after she had failed for the 5th time to land a single strike against him during a training exercise. "You fight like someone who still believes she does not deserve to win." The words struck deeper than any physical blow could have. Elena straightened, breathing hard, sweat dripping down her temple, and stared at him with something between anger and grief tangled together in her chest. "Maybe I don't," she said quietly. "Maybe they were right about me." Corvin's expression did not soften, but something in his voice shifted, growing quieter, more deliberate. 7 years, you told me. 7 years, you were told you were worthless, weak, a burden. And in 7 years, did you ever once challenge that story, or did you simply accept it, because everyone around you repeated it often enough that it began to feel true? Elena said nothing, because she had no answer that did not confirm exactly what he was suggesting. "Weakness is not a bloodline," Corvin continued. "It is a story people tell about you until you either believe it forever or you decide to write a different one. You have already taken the first step by walking away from the people who wrote that story for you. The only question left is whether you intend to finish writing a new one or whether you plan to stop halfway and let the old story win after all." Something in Elena's chest cracked open at those words, not with pain this time, but with a kind of clarity she had not experienced in years. She thought of every moment she had shrunk herself smaller to avoid drawing criticism, every time she had accepted a dismissive comment without argument, because arguing seemed pointless against people who had already decided who she was. "I don't want to stop halfway," she said, and for the first time since arriving at the camp, her voice carried real conviction. Corvin studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, as though she had passed some invisible test. "Then get up," he said, "and try again." She did. The weeks turned into months. Elena's body grew leaner and stronger, beneath Corvin's relentless training. Her reflexes sharpened. Her endurance, once non-existent, became something she could rely on, even through long, grueling sessions that stretched from dawn well into the afternoon. But it was not only her physical strength that transformed during those months. Corvin also began teaching her about pack law, territorial politics, the delicate negotiations that governed relationships between rival wolf communities. Subjects Blackwood had never bothered teaching in Omega, they assumed would never need such knowledge. An alpha leads with strength, Corvin explained one evening, as they sat by the fire pit going over the structure of territorial agreements. But a true leader understands that strength alone builds nothing lasting. Strategy, patience, the ability to read people and circumstances clearly. These are the qualities that separate rulers who last decades from rulers who burn brightly and collapse within a single season. Elena absorbed every lesson hungrily, filling notebooks Corvin provided with careful notes, asking questions late into the night, long after most students would have given up from exhaustion. She discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she possessed a natural aptitude for strategic thinking, an ability to anticipate outcomes several steps ahead, that even Corvin occasionally admitted impressed him. Yet despite the progress, something continued to nag at her during quiet moments, a persistent unease she could not fully explain. Her body responded to training differently than she expected an Omega's body to respond. Her senses, which had always been noticeably duller than other pack members growing up, seemed to be sharpening at a pace that felt unnatural, even accounting for months of intense conditioning. She mentioned this to Corvin one night, hesitant, half expecting him to dismiss the observation as simple progress from hard work. Instead, his expression grew unusually serious. He set down the cup he had been holding and studied her with an intensity that made her suddenly nervous. "How long have you noticed this shift?" he asked. "A few weeks," Elena admitted. "My hearing has become sharper than it ever was at Blackwood. My reflexes, too. I assumed it was simply the training, but it feels different somehow, deeper." Corvin was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though weighing some difficult decision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity she had not heard from him before. "There is a possibility," he said slowly, "that what you experienced at Blackwood was never a true reflection of your nature at all." Elena's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "There are ancient methods," Corvin continued, choosing his words with obvious care. "Old and largely forgotten, capable of suppressing a wolf's true strength from a very young age. Rare bloodlines have sometimes been deliberately weakened this way, hidden beneath false diagnoses of low status, kept quiet and unremarkable so they never threatened the standing of those already in power." The blood drained from Elena's face. "Are you saying someone did this to me?" "I am saying it is possible," Corvin said carefully. "I cannot know for certain without more evidence, but the pattern you describe, the sudden shifts in your senses and reflexes, now that you are far from Blackwood's influence, it is not consistent with an Omega simply training hard. It is consistent with something being unbound." Elena sat in stunned silence, turning the possibility over in her mind, feeling the fragile new sense of self she had spent months building suddenly crack open into something far larger and more uncertain than she had prepared herself for. If Corvin was right, then everything she had been told for 7 years, every insult, every dismissal, every claim that she was weak and worthless by nature, had been built on a lie. And if it had been a lie, someone within Blackwood had constructed it deliberately, someone with both the knowledge and the motivation to keep her hidden strength buried, for reasons she could not yet begin to guess. She thought immediately of Garrick, of his satisfaction at the gathering fire, of the strange comments and interrupted conversations that had followed her throughout childhood. A cold certainty began forming in her chest, one that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with a sharpening sense of purpose. "I need to know for certain," she said, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her. "Whatever this is, whatever was done to me, I need to understand it completely." Corvin studied her for a long moment, and something like approval crossed his weathered features. "Then we will find out together," he said. "But I warn you now, if this suspicion proves true, the path ahead of you will demand far more than anything I have asked of you so far. Uncovering a hidden bloodline and reclaiming a suppressed strength is not a gentle process. It will test you in ways training alone cannot prepare you for. Elena looked into the fire, watching the flames twist and climb into the darkening sky above the tree line, and felt the last remnants of the frightened, humiliated girl who had walked away from Blackwood territory finally settle into something new, something sharper and more determined. "I have already lost everything once," she said quietly. "I am not afraid of what comes next." Corvin nodded slowly, satisfaction and something like respect mingling in his expression. "Then tomorrow," he said, "we begin the real work." Outside the cabin, the fire crackled on into the night, and somewhere far beyond the ridge that hid their camp, the wheels of a much larger story had already begun turning, though neither of them yet knew how far its reach would eventually extend. Sleep did not come easily that night. Elena lay on her cot, staring at the wooden beams above her, replaying 7 years of her life through an entirely new lens. She remembered a childhood memory she had buried long ago, a moment when she was perhaps 6 years old, sitting in Garrick's study while he examined her with an odd, clinical curiosity that even then had felt wrong somehow, though she had been too young to understand why. She remembered the strange herbal tea her caretakers had insisted she drink every morning throughout her early childhood, a tradition that mysteriously stopped once she reached her teenage years, right around the time her supposed weakness had already been firmly established in the eyes of the pack. At the time, she had never questioned it. Now, lying in the dark, the memory sat heavy and suspicious in her chest. By morning, exhaustion clung to her, but so did a renewed sense of purpose. Corvin was already waiting in the training yard when she emerged from the cabin, his expression unreadable as always, though something in his posture suggested he had also spent a restless night considering the implications of what they had discussed. "Today is different," he told her, gesturing for her to follow him past the usual training equipment, toward a narrow trail she had not yet explored. "If what we suspect is true, pushing your body through ordinary training will only take you so far. We need to test the edges of what has been suppressed directly." The trail wound deeper into the forest than Elena had ventured before, eventually opening into a small clearing bordered by moss-covered stones, arranged in a rough circle. Corvin explained that the clearing had been used for generations by wolves seeking clarity, a place where old magic, thin and half-forgotten now, still lingered faintly in the earth. "I cannot promise this will reveal anything," he said, guiding her to the center of the stones. "But if there is truth buried beneath the story you were told, this is where it is most likely to surface." Elena stood in the center of the circle, uncertain what she was supposed to do, feeling faintly foolish, despite the gravity in Corvin's voice. He instructed her to close her eyes, to breathe slowly, to stop fighting against whatever sensations arose, and simply allow them to surface naturally. At first, nothing happened, beyond the ordinary sounds of the forest. Birds calling somewhere overhead, wind moving through the leaves. Elena began to wonder whether the entire exercise was pointless, a relic of old superstition rather than genuine insight. Then, gradually, a warmth began building beneath her skin, faint at first, then growing steadily stronger, radiating outward from somewhere deep in her chest. Her breath caught. The warmth intensified, not painful, but overwhelming in its unfamiliarity, like a door long sealed shut finally beginning to creak open, after years of pressure building silently behind it. Colors seemed to sharpen behind her closed eyelids. Sounds grew almost unbearably crisp, every rustle of leaves and distant bird call, arriving with startling clarity. "Something is happening," she gasped, eyes flying open, her heart pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Corvin, standing a careful distance away, watched with an expression caught between wariness and fascination. "Do not fight it," he said firmly. "Whatever surfaces, let it come." The warmth built further, spreading through her limbs, her fingertips tingling with an energy she had never experienced before, not even during the most intense moments of physical training. For one dizzying instant, Elena felt something vast and ancient stir somewhere deep within her, a presence that felt both entirely foreign and unmistakably, undeniably her own. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation receded, leaving her breathless and trembling in the center of the stone circle, her legs barely able to hold her upright. Corvin crossed the clearing quickly, steadying her with a firm hand on her shoulder. "What did you feel?" he asked, urgency replacing his usual measured calm. "Something enormous," Elena managed, still catching her breath. something that felt like it had been waiting a very long time to be noticed. Corvin's expression shifted into something Elena had not seen from him before, a mixture of vindication and genuine concern. "Then it is as I suspected," he said quietly. "You are not simply an Omega who has trained hard enough to improve. Something significant has been buried within you, deliberately and skillfully, for a very long time." Elena sank slowly onto one of the moss-covered stones, processing the weight of what he was telling her. 7 years of humiliation, of being told she was worthless, of watching every door close in her face while everyone around her accepted the story without question, and it appeared none of it had ever been true. "I need to know who did this," she said, her voice low and steady, despite the storm of emotion churning beneath the surface. "And I need to know why." Corvin knelt beside her, his weathered face unusually gentle in the fading afternoon light. "We will find out," he promised. "But first, you must grow strong enough to survive whatever truth we uncover. Whoever did this to you possessed both skill and motive, powerful enough to hide it successfully for 17 years or more. They will not simply allow that secret to surface without a fight." Elena looked out over the quiet clearing, feeling the last threads of her old identity, the frightened, dismissed Omega girl she had spent her whole life believing herself to be, finally beginning to unravel completely. "Then we had better make sure I am ready for that fight," she said. Corvin allowed himself a rare, small smile. "That," he said, "is exactly the answer I was hoping to hear." They walked back toward the cabin, as the sun began sinking behind the tree line, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. Neither spoke much during the walk, both lost in their own thoughts, but for the first time since arriving at the camp, Elena felt something steady settling into place inside her chest, something that felt remarkably like the first true foundation of confidence she had ever built for herself, on her own terms, without anyone else's permission required. Whatever waited ahead, whatever truth Corvin's training would eventually help her uncover, she intended to meet it standing tall, no longer the broken girl who had wandered away from a dying fire 7 months earlier, but someone entirely new, still forming, but undeniably, powerfully her own. 3 days after the incident in the stone circle, Elena woke to the sound of Corvin's fist pounding against the cabin door before dawn had fully broken. She sat up immediately, every muscle already tense, a habit she had developed over the months since arriving at the camp. "Get dressed," Corvin called through the door. "Quickly, we are not alone out here anymore." Her heart jumped into her throat as she scrambled into her training clothes and grabbed the small knife he had given her weeks earlier. When she stepped outside, she found him standing at the edge of the clearing, his body rigid with focus, his eyes fixed on the tree line to the north. "What is it?" she whispered. "Rogue scouts," he said quietly. 3 of them, moving toward the ridge. "They may simply be passing through, or they may have picked up your scent from the stone circle. Whatever residual energy surfaced during your session may have carried further than I anticipated." Elena's pulse quickened, fear, and something else, something sharper and more electric, coursing through her veins. Months of training had prepared her body for confrontation, but this was different from sparring sessions with Corvin. This was real, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous, in ways she had not yet faced since leaving Blackwood. "What do we do?" she asked. "We do not run," Corvin said firmly. "Running from rogues only invites pursuit. We hold our ground, and if necessary, we make it clear this territory is not worth the trouble." They positioned themselves near the tree line, Corvin instructing her in low, rapid whispers on positioning and timing, reminding her of techniques they had drilled dozens of times over the preceding months. Elena forced her breathing steady, drawing on every lesson, every hour of exhausting practice, refusing to let fear override the discipline she had worked so hard to build. The scouts emerged from the trees minutes later, 3 lean, hard-eyed wolves in human form, clearly assessing the camp with the calculating gaze of predators searching for weakness. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar running down one cheek, stepped forward first, his eyes narrowing as he took in Corvin's stance, and then shifted toward Elena. "Didn't expect company out here," the scarred man said, his voice carrying false friendliness that did nothing to mask the threat underneath. "This is rogue territory now. You're trespassing." "This land belongs to no pack," Corvin answered evenly. "You know that as well as I do. Turn back now, and there will be no trouble between us. The scarred man's gaze slid toward Elena again, lingering with an unpleasant curiosity that made her skin crawl. The girl smells different, he said slowly. Not quite human, not quite ordinary wolf either. Something interesting about her. Elena's stomach tightened, but she held her ground, refusing to let the fear show on her face. Months with Corvin had taught her that predators fed on visible weakness, and she was done offering that particular meal to anyone ever again. I suggest you keep walking, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The scarred man laughed, low and unimpressed, glancing back at his companions with amusement. Feisty little thing, he said. Might be worth bringing back to camp just to see what she's hiding. He moved fast, faster than Elena expected, closing the distance between them in a blur of motion, meant to intimidate rather than immediately attack. Old instincts, the frightened, deferential instincts of the Omega she had once believed herself to be, screamed at her to step back, to make herself smaller, to avoid confrontation at any cost. She did not listen to them. Something shifted inside her chest, the same warm, building sensation she had experienced days earlier in the stone circle, except now it surged forward without hesitation, sharp and immediate, fueled by adrenaline and months of buried anger finally finding an outlet. Her body moved before her mind fully caught up, sidestepping the scarred man's advance with a fluid precision that startled even her, driving her elbow hard into his ribs as he passed. He staggered back, genuine shock replacing his earlier amusement. That's not Omega speed, he muttered, rubbing his side, eyes narrowing with fresh calculation. The other two scouts moved to flank her, but Corvin was already there, intercepting one with practiced efficiency, while shouting instructions Elena barely needed anymore. Her senses had sharpened to a startling degree, every movement around her registering with crystal clarity, her body responding with reflexes that felt both foreign and completely natural at once. The scarred man lunged again, more serious this time, and Elena felt the warmth in her chest ignite fully, spreading through her limbs like liquid fire. She caught his wrist mid-strike, twisting with a strength she should not have possessed, and used his own momentum to throw him hard against the ground. The clearing fell silent except for the scarred man's ragged breathing as he stared up at her from the dirt, stunned disbelief written across his face. The remaining two scouts exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence visibly shaken. She's not Rogue, one of them muttered. She's something else entirely. Leave, Corvin said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Now, before this becomes a more permanent lesson. The scarred man scrambled to his feet, casting one final, calculating look at Elena before gesturing sharply to his companions. Within moments, all three had retreated back into the tree line, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. Elena stood frozen in the clearing, her chest heaving, her hands trembling not from fear now, but from the sheer intensity of what had just moved through her body. The warmth was already receding, leaving behind an exhausted, hollowed-out feeling, but something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone. That, Corvin said quietly, approaching her slowly, was not training. That was your true nature, responding under real threat. Elena looked down at her own hands, still faintly trembling, trying to reconcile the strength she had just felt, with 17 years, of believing herself incapable of anything remotely close to it. I have never moved like that in my life, she whispered. Because you were never allowed to, Corvin said. Whatever was done to you, it did not remove your strength entirely. It simply buried it deep enough that you learned to live without ever reaching for it. Today, under genuine threat, your body reached for it anyway. They spent the remainder of that day in tense silence, both aware that the encounter with the scouts, however it had ended, would likely draw further attention. Word traveled quickly among rogue territories, and a story about an unusually strong young woman training in the northern woods was not the kind of rumor that stayed contained for long. That evening, sitting by the fire, Corvin finally shared something of his own history, a story Elena had sensed lurking beneath his guarded exterior for months, but had never felt entitled to ask about directly. I was cast out once too, he said, staring into the flames. Many years ago, from a pack far from here, for reasons that seemed important at the time, and now feel almost laughably small in comparison to the years I lost rebuilding myself afterward. I understand better than most what it costs to lose everything you once called home." "What happened to your pack?" Elena asked quietly. "It no longer exists," Corvin said simply. "Poor leadership, internal betrayal, the same mistakes that destroy most territories eventually. Given enough time, and enough arrogance among those in power. I have spent years since then helping others who found themselves cast aside the way I once was, training them not simply to survive, but to become forces capable of reshaping the world that discarded them." Elena studied him in the firelight, understanding now why his methods, though harsh, had never once felt cruel for cruelty's sake. Every lesson, every grueling session, had been building toward something specific, something he clearly believed she was capable of achieving. "You think I can do that," she said. "Reshape the world that discarded me." "I think," Corvin said slowly, "that whoever suppressed your true strength did so because they recognized something in you dangerous enough to warrant 17 years of careful concealment. That is not something done to protect a genuinely weak bloodline. That is something done to protect someone else's position from a threat they took very seriously." The implications of that statement settled heavily over Elena as she stared into the fire. If her suppression had been deliberate, calculated, sustained over nearly 2 decades, then whoever orchestrated it had invested enormous effort into keeping her contained. Garrick's satisfaction at the gathering fire suddenly took on new, darker meaning. Over the following weeks, Elena's training intensified beyond anything she had previously experienced. Corvin pushed her not only physically but mentally, teaching her to access the surging strength she had discovered during the confrontation with the rogue scouts deliberately, rather than relying on adrenaline alone to summon it. Progress came slowly, marked by frustrating failures and small, hard-won breakthroughs, but steadily, undeniably, Elena began to understand and control the power that had lain dormant within her for so long. She also began studying pack history more seriously, poring over old texts Corvin kept in the cabin, searching for any reference to ancient bloodlines capable of the kind of suppression she had experienced. The information was scattered and incomplete, hidden within obscure passages and half-forgotten legends, but gradually, a picture began forming. There existed, according to the oldest texts, rare bloodlines known as primes, wolves born with abilities and instincts far beyond even the strongest alphas, capable of uniting fractured territories and commanding loyalty that transcended ordinary pack hierarchy. Primes appeared rarely, sometimes only once in several generations across an entire region, and their emergence had historically reshaped the balance of power wherever they arose. The parallels to her own situation were impossible to ignore. Elena read the passages repeatedly, her hands trembling with a mixture of disbelief and dawning certainty. If she truly carried prime bloodline, suppressed and hidden for 17 years, it would explain everything. The strange herbal treatments of her childhood, Garrick's clinical curiosity, the desperate insistence on labeling her weak despite instincts and reflexes that, once freed, had proven capable of overpowering a trained rogue fighter without significant effort. "If this is true," she said to Corvin one evening, closing the ancient text carefully, "then Garrick did not simply dislike me. He saw me as a threat worth neutralizing entirely." Corvin nodded gravely. A prime bloodline, left to develop naturally, would eventually outshine any alpha bloodline standing beside it. If Garrick recognized what you carried early in your childhood, suppressing it and ensuring your public humiliation would have been the simplest way to protect whatever position or influence he stood to lose otherwise. Elena sat with that realization for a long moment, feeling old grief slowly giving way to something colder and more focused. The humiliation at the gathering fire, the years of dismissal and quiet cruelty, none of it had been about her own inadequacy at all. It had been about someone else's fear, someone else's determination, to protect their own power, at the cost of her entire childhood and identity. "I want to know everything," she said finally, her voice steady and resolute. "Not just for my own sake anymore. If Garrick did this to me, there is no telling how many others he may have manipulated or harmed to maintain his position within Blackwood." Corvin studied her closely, clearly recognizing the shift taking place within her, the transformation, from someone driven purely by personal survival, into someone beginning to understand a larger purpose unfolding ahead of her. "Then we continue," he said. "But understand, Elena, uncovering this truth and eventually confronting it will require more than raw strength alone. It will require patience, strategy, and the kind of quiet, deliberate power that does not announce itself until the moment it can no longer be ignored. Elena looked out at the darkening forest beyond the cabin, feeling the weight of everything ahead of her settle firmly onto her shoulders, not as a burden this time, but as a purpose she intended to carry forward, with everything she now understood herself to be capable of. "Then let's begin building that power," she said. "However long it takes." The months that followed blurred together into a steady rhythm of discipline and discovery. Elena rose before dawn each day, trained until her body ached beyond anything she had thought possible, studied ancient texts late into the evening, and slept only when exhaustion finally overpowered the restless energy humming beneath her skin. Slowly, painstakingly, she learned to summon her strength deliberately, rather than waiting for danger to force it forward, until the surging warmth in her chest became something she could call upon at will, rather than something that controlled her. Corvin introduced harder challenges as her control improved. He brought in old contacts, other rogue wolves scattered throughout the region, who owed him favors, or respected his reputation enough to spar against her under controlled conditions. Elena lost more matches than she won during those early sessions, humbled repeatedly by fighters with decades of experience she could not yet match. But she noticed, session after session, that her losses grew narrower, her recovery time shorter, her instincts sharper with each new opponent she faced. One such contact, a lean, quick-witted woman named Priya who ran a small band of rogue fighters 2 territories over, became something close to a friend during those months. Priya had no patience for pack politics, and even less patience for wasted potential, and she took a particular interest in pushing Elena past the polite restraint that still lingered from her years at Blackwood. "You keep holding back," Priya told her during one sparring session, easily deflecting a strike Elena had thrown with obvious hesitation. "Even now, even after everything Corvin tells me you have survived, you still fight like you are afraid of taking up too much space."
"Old habits,"
Elena admitted, frustrated with herself.
"Old habits get you hurt,"
Priya said bluntly. "Or worse, they get you killed by someone who has no interest in your history, and every interest in your throat. Stop apologizing for your own strength. Nobody out here is going to reward you for staying small." The words stuck with Elena long after that session ended, echoing alongside Corvin's earlier lessons about the story she had spent 7 years believing about herself. Bit by bit, session by session, she began unlearning the instinct to minimize herself, replacing it with a growing confidence that felt earned rather than simply performed. By the time autumn gave way to winter, Elena had grown into someone her earlier self would barely have recognized. Her body moved with controlled precision now, each motion deliberate and efficient. Her understanding of pack law and territorial politics had deepened considerably through months of study, giving her a strategic awareness that complemented her physical growth. And beneath it all, the prime bloodline Corvin suspected she carried continued revealing itself in small, startling increments, heightened senses, faster healing, and instinctive awareness of shifting dynamics within any group she found herself among. Word of her progress had also begun spreading quietly through the loose network of rogue territories surrounding Corvin's camp. Nothing dramatic yet, nothing that had reached organized packs or drawn unwanted attention from anyone connected to Blackwood, but enough that occasional wolves passing through the region asked Corvin, with careful curiosity, about the young woman training under his guidance. "They are starting to notice you," Corvin told her one evening, as winter's first snow began settling quietly over the camp. "Not by name yet, and not with any real understanding of what you are becoming, but rumors travel, and rumors have a way of eventually reaching exactly the ears you would prefer they avoid." Elena considered this carefully, weighing the implications. "Are you telling me to slow down?" "I am telling you," Corvin said, "that the time is approaching when hiding here indefinitely will no longer be a realistic option. You cannot remain a secret forever, and eventually, you will need to decide how and when you want your existence to become known, rather than allowing that decision to be made for you by circumstance." The words settled heavily in Elena's chest, not with fear this time, but with a kind of steady, deliberate resolve. She had spent months rebuilding herself in isolation, and while she understood the wisdom in Corvin's caution, she also recognized that hiding indefinitely would only delay the confrontation she had promised herself back at that fire pit in Blackwood territory, the confrontation with Garrick, with the truth of what had been done to her, and eventually, though she was not yet ready to examine this thought too closely, with Damien himself. "When the time comes," she said quietly, staring into the snow beginning to blanket the clearing, "I want to step forward as someone they cannot dismiss, not as the frightened Omega they cast aside, and not simply as an angry victim seeking revenge. I want to step forward as someone whose strength speaks entirely for itself." Corvin studied her for a long moment, snow settling silently in his silver-streaked hair, and something like genuine pride crossed his weathered features. "Then we have considerable work still ahead of us," he said, "because becoming that person requires more than strength alone. It requires patience most people your age have never been forced to develop, and a willingness to build slowly, deliberately, even when every instinct urges you to move faster than wisdom allows." Elena nodded, understanding the truth in his words even as impatience simmered quietly beneath her calm exterior. She had waited 17 years without knowing what had been taken from her. She could wait a while longer now, armed with knowledge and growing strength, to ensure that when she finally did step back into the world that had discarded her, she would do so as someone utterly impossible to ignore. That winter, as snow blanketed the training yard and ancient texts filled her evenings with steadily deepening understanding of her own hidden nature, Elena Voss began, quietly and deliberately, transforming into someone the wolf world had never quite seen before. 3 years later, in a narrow canyon past 200 miles from Blackwood territory, two rival bands of rogue wolves faced each other across a stretch of contested ground, weapons drawn, tempers already boiling toward violence that would leave bodies scattered across the rocks before sundown. "Enough," a woman's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding, carrying easily across the canyon despite its measured volume. "Put the weapons down, now." Both groups turned toward the voice, startled by the interruption. A young woman stood atop a ridge overlooking the standoff, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her posture radiating an authority that made even hardened fighters hesitate. She wore simple, practical clothing, nothing that marked her as belonging to any particular pack or faction, yet something about her presence alone was enough to make both groups pause their advance. "Who in the world do you think you are?" one of the rogue leaders shouted up at her, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Someone who has watched 3 canyon disputes end in unnecessary bloodshed over territory. Neither of you actually needs," the woman answered, descending the ridge with unhurried confidence. "This canyon splits water rights between both your camps if you simply agree to rotate access by season. I have already drafted the terms. Whether you choose violence or reason is entirely up to you, but know that if this turns to bloodshed, I will hold both leaders personally responsible for what comes afterward." The rogue leaders exchanged uncertain glances. They had heard stories, whispered rumors traveling through rogue territories over the past 2 years, about a woman who called herself Rain, who settled disputes between warring factions with a combination of calm authority and, when necessary, a level of physical skill that had already ended several confrontations before they escalated into anything serious. "And if we refuse your terms?" the second leader asked, testing. Rain's expression did not change, but something shifted in her posture, subtle and unmistakable, the kind of stillness predators recognized instinctively as genuine danger rather than empty bluff. "Then I suppose we will discover exactly how much of the rumors about me happen to be true." The tension held for several long, uncertain seconds. Then, gradually, weapons began lowering on both sides, tension bleeding slowly out of the canyon, as both leaders, unwilling to test her claim directly, agreed to the terms she had proposed. By the time the sun set that evening, the dispute that had nearly cost a dozen lives had been resolved without a single drop of blood spilled, and Rain's reputation, already considerable, grew a little further still. It had been 3 years since Elena Voss walked away from Corvin's camp, no longer the frightened girl who had arrived there broken and humiliated, but someone reborn entirely through discipline, study, and the slow, deliberate reclamation of a bloodline that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to understand what she had lost. She had taken the name Rain during her first months moving independently through rogue territories, a small but deliberate act of reinvention, a way of stepping into her new identity, without carrying the weight of Blackwood's judgment attached to every syllable of her old name. Word of Rain's reputation had spread steadily across the loosely connected network of rogue packs and smaller territories scattered throughout the region. She resolved disputes others considered unsolvable. She trained fighters who came to her seeking guidance, passing along lessons Corvin had once taught her. She built quiet alliances between factions that had spent years locked in pointless, draining conflict, earning trust through consistency and fairness rather than force alone, though force remained available whenever reason failed to persuade. That evening, camped near the canyon she had just helped pacify, Rain sat by a small fire, reviewing reports Priya had gathered from contacts scattered across the region. Priya had joined her permanently after that first winter at Corvin's camp, no longer simply a sparring partner, but a trusted advisor who understood the shifting political landscape of rogue territories better than almost anyone else Rain had encountered. Blackwood territory keeps coming up in the reports, Priya said, settling onto a rock across the fire. Not good news for them either. 3 failed trade negotiations this year. 2 smaller allied packs have quietly withdrawn their support. People are saying the Alpha has lost his grip on things since his father passed leadership fully into his hands. Rain's expression remained carefully neutral, though something tightened briefly in her chest at the mention of Blackwood. She had spent 3 years deliberately avoiding news of her old territory, focusing entirely on her own growth, rather than dwelling on people who had discarded her without a second thought. But avoidance, she was slowly realizing, only worked for so long. "What else are they saying?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "That the Alpha made a serious mistake years ago," Priya said carefully, watching Rain's reaction closely. "Something about casting aside a mate bond that would have strengthened the pack considerably. Nobody says her name specifically. Most people assume she simply disappeared or died out in rogue territory. But the timing lines up with when you first arrived here, and I have my suspicions." Rain said nothing for a long moment, staring into the fire, memories of that humiliating night at the gathering circle, rising unbidden, despite 3 years of distance and transformation. She thought of Damien's flat, final voice, declaring her worthless in front of the entire pack, of Garrick's satisfied smile as he watched her world collapse. "They will find out eventually," she said finally, "but on my terms, when I choose to reveal it, not before." Priya nodded, respecting the boundary without pressing further, though her sharp eyes lingered thoughtfully on Rain's carefully composed expression a moment longer. Over the following weeks, Rain continued expanding her influence throughout the rogue territories, unifying 3 previously fractured packs under a loose alliance built on mutual respect and shared resources rather than forced submission. The wolves who joined her did so willingly, drawn by her reputation for fairness and her evident strength that had become impossible to hide or downplay any longer, no matter how quietly she preferred to operate. It was during a gathering to formalize this new alliance, held in a wide clearing bordered by ancient oak trees, that someone first spoke the title that would follow her for years afterward. An older rogue leader, addressing the assembled crowd, referred to her not simply as Rain, the skilled negotiator and fighter they had come to respect, but as something larger, more significant. "She rises like a rival to every Alpha who forgot what true leadership requires," the elder declared, raising his voice for the gathered crowd to hear clearly. "Not through inherited title, but through strength earned honestly, strategy built patiently, and respect given freely, rather than demanded through fear. I say we call her what she truly is, a queen among us, standing as rival to every throne, built on cruelty and false judgment." The crowd's response was immediate and enthusiastic, the title spreading through the gathering like wildfire, and by the time the alliance formalized that evening, Rival Queen had already attached itself firmly to Rain's growing reputation, a title she had never sought, but found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, unwilling to reject. Later that night, standing alone at the edge of the gathering, while celebrations continued around the bonfire, Corvin approached her quietly, his weathered face carrying an expression of quiet pride he rarely displayed so openly. 3 years, he said, standing beside her, watching the celebration with satisfaction. 3 years since you followed me into these woods, with nothing but the clothes on your back, and a spark of anger you did not yet know how to direct. Look at what you have built since then. I could not have built any of it without you, Rain said quietly, genuine gratitude coloring her voice. You built it yourself, Corvin corrected firmly. I simply gave you the tools and the space to discover what was already within you. Everything else, the strength, the strategy, the reputation that now travels these territories ahead of you, that was always yours to claim. I only helped you remember it existed. Rain looked out over the celebrating crowd, wolves from 3 previously divided packs, now united under a single purpose, following her leadership, not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine respect, earned through years of consistent, deliberate work. She thought of the frightened, humiliated girl who had once believed every insult hurled at her by Blackwood's elders, and felt an enormous, quiet satisfaction settling into place where that old grief had once lived. There is still work ahead, she said, turning to Corvin with renewed determination. Garrick is still out there, and whatever he did to me, he has likely done to others as well. Blackwood is struggling under Damien's leadership, and eventually, that struggle will bring them into direct contact with the territories I have united. Are you ready for that? Corvin asked seriously. Rain considered the question carefully, weighing 3 years of growth against the old wounds she still carried. Wounds that had healed into something stronger, rather than fading away entirely. I am no longer the person they cast out, she said finally. Whatever happens when our paths cross again, I intend to meet it as exactly who I have become, not who they once decided I was. Corvin nodded, satisfaction and confidence mingling in his expression as he studied the woman standing beside him, no longer resembling in any way the broken, humiliated girl he had found wandering an empty road 3 years earlier. Then let us prepare properly, he said. Because from everything the reports suggest, that meeting may be closer than either of us anticipated. Rain turned back toward the celebration, watching the fire climb high into the night sky, and felt, for the first time since that devastating night at Blackwood's gathering circle, something that felt remarkably close to genuine anticipation rather than dread. Whatever waited ahead, she intended to face it as the rival queen the territories had already named her, not as the worthless Omega Blackwood had discarded so carelessly 7 years before. 200 miles away, within the great hall of Blackwood territory, Damien Cross sat at the head of a long table, listening to yet another report of failed negotiations, with growing frustration he could no longer fully conceal. 7 years had passed since the night he stood before his pack and cast Elena aside, and in those 7 years, the confident certainty that had guided his decision that night had eroded steadily, replaced by a nagging unease he had never managed to fully silence. The Southern Alliance has withdrawn their support entirely, his advisor reported, sliding a document across the table. They cite instability within our leadership structure. 2 other territories are reportedly considering similar action. Damien rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of 7 years of gradually accumulating consequences pressing down on him. His father had built Blackwood into one of the strongest territories in the region, through decades of careful alliance building and consistent leadership. Since inheriting full authority 3 years earlier, Damien had watched that carefully constructed foundation crumble beneath him piece by piece, despite his best efforts to hold it together. And Garrick's counsel on this matter? Damien asked, though the question carried more bitterness than genuine curiosity these days. The elder recommends stronger enforcement measures against neighboring territories to demonstrate our continued strength, the advisor said carefully. Damien's jaw tightened. Garrick's advice over the past several years had consistently pushed toward aggression and control, rather than the patient diplomacy his father had once favored, and the results had spoken clearly enough for themselves. Alliances that had held strong for generations were fracturing under policies Garrick continually insisted were necessary for maintaining Blackwood's standing. Send Garrick to me, Damien said finally. I want to discuss this directly. When Garrick arrived in his private study an hour later, Damien studied the elder carefully, searching for something he could not quite name, some explanation for the persistent unease that had followed him since that night at the gathering fire 7 years earlier. You wanted to see me, Alpha, Garrick said, his tone carrying the same practiced deference it always had, though something beneath the surface had shifted subtly over the years, a confidence that occasionally bordered on presumption Damien's father would never have tolerated. The Southern Alliance has withdrawn support, Damien said directly. That makes 3 territories in as many years. Your council has consistently pushed toward aggressive posturing rather than negotiation, and the results speak for themselves. Garrick's expression flickered, something calculating passing briefly behind his eyes, before settling back into practiced neutrality. Strength must be demonstrated clearly in uncertain times, Alpha. Weakness invites exploitation from every direction. And yet weakness is exactly what our territory has shown these past years, Damien countered, frustration finally breaking through his usual composure. I have followed your counsel faithfully since taking full leadership, Garrick, and Blackwood has grown weaker with every passing year, rather than stronger. I begin to wonder whether your advice has genuinely served this pack's interests, or something else entirely. Something sharp crossed Garrick's expression at that, quickly masked, but not quickly enough to escape Damien's notice entirely. For a moment, the elder's composed exterior cracked just slightly, revealing something colder underneath. I have served this pack faithfully for decades, Garrick said, his voice carrying a careful edge, including advice given regarding certain liabilities that once threatened this pack's stability. The reference was unmistakable, and Damien felt old, buried discomfort rise sharply to the surface. You mean Elena? I mean the wisdom of removing weakness before it could compromise this pack's future, Garrick said smoothly. A decision that served Blackwood's interests then, and continues to serve them now. Damien studied the elder carefully, memories he had spent 7 years trying not to examine too closely rising unbidden. He remembered Elena's face that night, the disbelief and quiet devastation in her eyes, as he delivered words he had never fully believed even as he spoke them. He remembered the strange satisfaction Garrick had displayed throughout the entire proceeding, a satisfaction that, looking back now with 7 years of hindsight, had never quite matched the situation's supposed gravity. Tell me something, Garrick, Damien said slowly, watching the elder's face with new scrutiny. What exactly was so threatening about an Omega girl, with no notable bloodline, and no particular strength? Why did her presence beside me require such urgent, public removal? Garrick's composure held, but Damien noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible pause before he answered. Her weakness would have undermined pack perception of strength during a critical leadership transition, Garrick said carefully. Perception matters enormously in maintaining territorial standing, Alpha, as you well understand. The explanation, which had satisfied Damien completely 7 years earlier, now struck him as thin, insufficient, carefully constructed rather than genuinely reasoned. He said nothing further on the matter that evening, but as Garrick left his study, Damien found himself staring at the closed door for a long time afterward, turning over 7 years of accumulated doubt with fresh, uncomfortable clarity. Later that night, alone in his private quarters, Damien pulled out old pack records he had not examined in years, searching through documentation from Elena's early childhood, searching for anything that might explain the persistent unease, finally demanding his full attention after 7 years of careful avoidance. Much of what he found was unremarkable, ordinary records of an Omega child's development within the pack. But buried within one folder, he found something that stopped him cold, a series of medical consultation notes, signed by Garrick himself, dating back to when Elena was barely 6 years old, documenting regular treatments, prescribed for reasons the notes described only vaguely, as developmental stabilization, treatments that had continued for years, before stopping abruptly around the time Elena's supposed weakness had become firmly established within pack perception. Damien stared at the documents for a long time, a cold, creeping suspicion beginning to take root in his chest, one he was not yet ready to fully confront, but one that would not allow itself to be dismissed as easily as it once might have been. Whatever had truly happened to Elena Voss 7 years earlier, Damien was beginning to suspect it had very little to do with genuine weakness, and a great deal more to do with something Garrick had worked carefully to hide. The challenge came 3 weeks after the alliance formalized, delivered by messenger to Rain's camp in the traditional manner, rogue territories reserved for matters of serious dispute. A wolf named Torin, leader of a 4th territory bordering the newly formed alliance, refused to recognize her authority and demanded a formal challenge to prove whether the title being whispered throughout the region, Rival Queen, carried any real substance behind it. He wants a public contest, Priya reported, reading through the formal terms Torin's messenger had delivered, witnessed by representatives from every surrounding territory. If you win, his lands join the alliance voluntarily. If you lose, the alliance dissolves entirely, and every pack currently under your protection, reverts to independent status, vulnerable to whatever pressure Torin chooses to apply afterward. Rain read through the terms carefully, recognizing immediately the calculated risk embedded within them. Torin was not simply seeking territory. He was testing whether the rumors surrounding her, the strength that had ended conflicts without bloodshed, the strategic mind that had united fractured packs peacefully, amounted to anything more substantial than reputation and clever negotiation. "Accept the terms," Rain said without hesitation. Corvin, standing nearby, studied her carefully. "You understand what accepting means. Torin is not a minor threat. He has led his territory through open conflict for over a decade, and built his reputation on physical dominance rather than diplomacy." "I understand exactly what it means," Rain said. "It means the alliance I have built over the past 3 years needs more than whispered reputation to survive long term. It needs proof, witnessed publicly, that cannot be dismissed or doubted afterward." The contest was set for 2 weeks later, at a neutral clearing equidistant between all participating territories. Word spread rapidly throughout the region once the challenge became public knowledge, and by the appointed day, representatives from a dozen surrounding territories had gathered to witness the outcome, some genuinely curious about the woman whose reputation had grown so quickly, others simply eager to see whether the rumors would collapse under direct scrutiny. Torin proved every bit as formidable as his reputation suggested. Tall, heavily muscled, moving with the confident ease of someone who had never once doubted his own physical superiority, he entered the clearing to considerable applause from his own supporters, clearly expecting the contest to end quickly and decisively in his favor. Rain entered from the opposite side, calm and composed, her expression giving away nothing of the careful strategic calculations already running through her mind. 3 years of training under Corvin's relentless guidance had prepared her for exactly this kind of confrontation, teaching her that raw strength alone, however impressive, could be overcome through patience, precision, and the willingness to endure punishment while waiting for the right opening to present itself. "Should have known you would actually show up," Torin said, addressing her directly, as the contest's formal terms were read aloud by a neutral witness. "Most reputations built on rumor tend to disappear rather than face genuine testing." "You will find," Rain replied evenly, "that I have very little interest in reputations that cannot be backed by substance." The contest began without further ceremony. Torin attacked immediately, relying on speed and overwhelming physical force, clearly hoping to end the confrontation quickly, before Rain's strategic advantages could come into play. She met his initial assault with careful, controlled defense, absorbing several heavy strikes that would have ended the contest against a less prepared opponent, allowing him to expend energy while she studied his patterns, his tells, the subtle rhythms underlying his aggressive approach. Minutes passed, the crowd growing increasingly tense as Torin's attacks continued landing without apparent resistance beyond Rain's careful defense. Whispers began circulating among the assembled representatives, some questioning whether her reputation had indeed been overstated after all. Then, as Torin committed to a particularly heavy strike, meant to finally end the confrontation decisively, Rain moved. The warmth she had spent 3 years learning to summon deliberately flooded through her limbs, and she sidestepped his attack with fluid, startling speed, driving a precise counterstrike into a pressure point along his extended arm that sent a shock of pain rippling through his entire body. Torin staggered, momentarily stunned by the unexpected response, and Rain pressed the advantage immediately, moving with a combination of speed and technical precision that left little room for his brute strength to compensate. Within moments, the confrontation that had appeared entirely one-sided in Torin's favor shifted dramatically, and the crowd's murmuring transformed from doubt into stunned silence. The contest ended minutes later, with Torin pinned firmly against the ground, unable to break free from a hold Rain had learned and perfected over hundreds of hours of practice, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by genuine shock. "Yield," Rain said quietly, giving him one final opportunity to end the confrontation, with some remaining dignity intact. Torin, breathing hard, stared up at her, with an expression caught between disbelief and grudging respect. "Yield," he said finally, the word clearly costing him considerable pride to speak aloud. Rain released him immediately and stepped back, extending a hand to help him rise rather than allowing the moment to become one of humiliation rather than simple victory. Torin accepted the gesture, studying her with new consideration as he climbed back to his feet. "You fight like someone who has been underestimated her entire life," he said quietly, only for her ears, "and learned to make that underestimation someone else's mistake rather than your own weakness." "You have no idea how accurate that observation happens to be," Rain replied. The assembled representatives, witnesses to a contest that had begun with widespread skepticism and ended with undeniable proof of Rain's capabilities, began speaking among themselves with renewed interest. The earlier doubts about her reputation, entirely dissolved by what they had just witnessed firsthand. Torin, true to the contest terms, formally pledged his territory's allegiance to the growing alliance, and by the time the gathering dispersed that evening, word of the outcome had already begun spreading rapidly through every connected territory in the region. Within weeks, additional territories began approaching Rain independently, some seeking formal alliance, others simply requesting audience to better understand the growing power consolidating in the region under her leadership. What had begun 3 years earlier as a desperate, isolated act of survival, following her banishment from Blackwood, had transformed steadily into something far larger, a genuine political and military force, capable of reshaping the balance of power across the entire region. It was during one such audience, held several weeks after the contest with Torin, that the deeper truth of Rain's bloodline finally became public knowledge beyond her closest circle. An elderly wolf, one of the few remaining scholars still versed in the old histories of prime bloodlines, arrived at her camp, seeking to verify rumors he had heard traveling through the territories. "I have spent decades studying the old records," the scholar explained, studying Rain with careful, searching attention during their meeting. "Prime bloodlines have not surfaced openly in this region for over 3 generations. If the accounts I have gathered are accurate, what you carry within you is exceedingly rare and exceedingly significant." He conducted a series of careful tests, some involving old rituals, similar to what Corvin had first used in the Stone Circle years earlier. Others, involving detailed questioning about her sensory experiences and physical capabilities. By the end of his examination, his expression had shifted from careful scholarly curiosity into something closer to genuine awe. "There is no doubt remaining in my mind," he told her finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering news he understood would reshape everything that followed. "You carry prime bloodline, undeniably and powerfully. Whoever suppressed it during your childhood possessed considerable skill, but the strength beneath that suppression was always genuine, always significant, and now, having been unbound, will only continue growing stronger as you learn to fully harness it." The confirmation, delivered formally, and with scholarly authority, impossible to dismiss as mere rumor, spread through the connected territories with remarkable speed. Wolves who had followed Rain's leadership out of respect for her, demonstrated skill and fairness, now understood they were following something considerably more significant, a genuine prime, the kind of leader capable of uniting entire regions under a single, stable authority, for the first time in generations. "They are calling you queen now, without hesitation," Priya told her one evening, several weeks after the scholar's visit, as they reviewed reports from territories throughout the region. "Not simply as a title of respect, but as genuine political reality. 5 territories have formally pledged allegiance. Another 8 have requested official audience to discuss alliance terms." Rain absorbed this information carefully, feeling the weight of what she had built settling meaningfully onto her shoulders. 3 years earlier, she had walked away from a dying fire, with nothing but a torn dress and a spark of determination, refusing to be extinguished. Now, standing at the center of a rapidly expanding political and military force, she found herself facing responsibilities and possibilities she had never once imagined possible during her years as Blackwood's dismissed, discarded Omega. "And Blackwood?" she asked quietly, unable to avoid the question any longer. "What news travels from that direction?" Priya's expression grew more careful, struggling considerably, from what the reports suggest. 3 failed alliances in as many years. Internal tension between the Alpha and his senior elder, though the specifics remain unclear. "And Rain, they have begun hearing about you as well. Not by your old name, not yet, but the rumors of a rising prime uniting rogue territories has reached even Blackwood's borders." Rain sat with that information for a long moment, feeling old memories stir uncomfortably beneath the calm, controlled exterior she had spent 3 years carefully constructing. She thought of Damien's flat, final voice declaring her worthless in front of the entire pack. She thought of Garrick's satisfied smile. The years of careful manipulation she now understood had shaped nearly her entire childhood. "Let them hear," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotion churning quietly beneath the surface. "Let the rumors grow. When Blackwood finally learns the truth of who I have become, I want them to understand exactly what they discarded 7 years ago, and exactly what that decision has ultimately cost them." Corvin, listening quietly from across the fire, studied her with quiet satisfaction, recognizing in her measured resolve the culmination of 3 years of careful, deliberate transformation. "The girl who left Blackwood territory 7 years ago no longer exists," he said. "What remains is someone considerably more dangerous, considerably more capable, and considerably less willing to accept dismissal from anyone, regardless of title or bloodline." "Good," Rain said simply, watching the fire climb steadily into the darkening sky above them. "Because I suspect our paths will cross again soon enough, and when they do, I intend to meet Blackwood, not as the Omega they discarded, but as exactly what I have become." Outside the fire's warm circle, the vast network of territories now aligned under her growing influence stretched across the region, a foundation 3 years in the careful, deliberate building, waiting only for the moment when the past she had left behind would finally, inevitably, collide with the powerful future she had built entirely on her own terms. The growing alliance was not without its dangers. As word of Rain's expanding influence spread throughout the region, opposition began forming as well. Smaller factions unwilling to accept a woman's rise to power, threatened by the stability her leadership offered to territories that had once profited from ongoing chaos and division. The most serious of these threats emerged nearly 2 months after the scholar's confirmation of her prime bloodline, when a coalition of 3 smaller, aggressive territories banded together, determined to strike against the alliance before it grew too powerful to challenge effectively. The attack came at night, coordinated and deliberate, targeting one of the smaller allied packs along the alliance's eastern border. Rain received word of the assault just after midnight, messengers arriving breathless and urgent, reporting that the small pack was badly outnumbered and unlikely to survive until dawn without reinforcement. "How far?" Rain asked, already moving toward her gear, adrenaline sharpening every sense as 3 years of training took hold instinctively. 6 hours by fastest travel, Priya reported grimly. "We cannot reach them in time through conventional means." Rain paused only briefly, weighing options with the strategic clarity Corvin had spent years cultivating within her. "Then we do not travel conventionally," she said. "Priya, gather every fighter capable of sustained speed. Corvin, I need the northern pass route, the one you showed me during winter training. It cuts nearly 2 hours from standard travel time if we push hard enough." The journey that followed tested every ounce of endurance Rain had built over 3 years of relentless training. She led a small, elite group of fighters through treacherous mountain terrain, under cover of darkness, pushing the pace well beyond what most wolves could sustain, relying on the deepened senses and stamina her unbound prime bloodline provided to guide them safely through passages that would have proven impassable to ordinary travelers. They arrived just before dawn, finding the small allied pack's defenses badly battered, but still holding, barely, against the coordinated assault. Rain entered the confrontation without hesitation, her presence alone shifting the battle's momentum, as attacking fighters, recognizing her by reputation, hesitated at the sight of the woman, whose growing legend had already reached every corner of the region. The confrontation that followed tested Rain more severely than any previous challenge she had faced, forcing her to draw deeply on both physical skill and strategic thinking as she coordinated her reinforcements against a numerically superior force. She fought not with reckless aggression, but with the calculated precision Corvin had spent years instilling within her, identifying weaknesses in the attacking coalition's coordination and exploiting them systematically until their organized assault collapsed into disorganized retreat. By mid-morning, the attacking coalition had withdrawn entirely, their coordinated strike broken by reinforcements arriving faster than anyone had believed possible, and led by a woman whose reputation, until that morning, some had still dismissed as exaggerated rumor. The small allied pack, battered but ultimately saved from destruction, greeted Rain with a gratitude that carried the weight of genuine loyalty rather than simple political obligation. You could have lost everything riding out here so quickly, Priya told her afterward, tending to a shallow wound along Rain's forearm as the exhausted group finally rested. The northern pass alone could have killed half our fighters if you had misjudged the terrain even slightly. I did not misjudge it, Rain said simply, though exhaustion weighed heavily in her voice. I could not misjudge it, not when the alternative meant abandoning people who trusted us to protect them. Priya studied her carefully, something thoughtful crossing her expression. You know, 3 years ago, when Corvin first brought you to camp, I did not believe you would survive your first season alone in rogue territory, let alone build what you have built since then. Neither did I, Rain admitted, allowing herself a rare moment of vulnerability now that the immediate danger had passed. I only knew I refused to remain the person Blackwood decided I was. Everything since then has simply been the result of that single decision, followed through one difficult step at a time. News of the successful defense spread even more rapidly than her earlier victory over Torin, cementing her reputation not merely as a skilled negotiator and formidable fighter, but as a leader genuinely willing to risk everything to protect those who had placed their trust in her. Additional territories, previously hesitant to commit fully to the growing alliance, began formalizing their allegiance in the weeks that followed, drawn by demonstrated proof rather than mere rumor. It was during this period of rapid expansion that the first direct communication arrived from Blackwood territory, a formal request for audience, delivered through proper diplomatic channels, citing ongoing territorial disputes that had begun affecting trade routes near the alliance's growing borders. The request made no mention of Rain's true identity, addressing her simply by the name now known throughout the region, but something in the careful, formal wording suggested Blackwood's leadership understood they were approaching someone considerably more significant than a simple rogue territory leader. Rain held the letter for a long time after Priya delivered it, feeling the careful, controlled composure she had built over 3 years, wavering slightly at the sight of Blackwood's formal seal pressed into the parchment. They want a meeting, she said finally, setting the letter down with deliberate calm. Formal negotiations regarding trade routes and territorial boundaries. Do they know who they are actually requesting audience with? Corvin asked carefully, watching her reaction. I doubt it, Rain said. 7 years is a long time. I imagine they still believe the Omega they cast aside either died in rogue territory or simply disappeared into obscurity, exactly as they expected. A long silence stretched between them as the weight of the coming confrontation settled fully over the camp. Rain had spent 3 years building strength, alliances, and a reputation that now made her one of the most significant powers in the entire region. And yet the prospect of finally standing face to face with Damien and Garrick again stirred something within her that 3 years of careful control had not entirely erased. Are you ready for this? Corvin asked quietly. Rain considered the question seriously, drawing on every lesson she had learned since that devastating night at the gathering fire, every hour of training, every difficult truth she had uncovered about her own suppressed bloodline, and the deliberate manipulation that had shaped her entire childhood. I have spent 3 years preparing for exactly this moment, she said finally, her voice steady and resolute. Whatever happens when I walk into that meeting, I intend to walk in as exactly who I have become, not as who they once decided I was. She picked up the letter again, studying Blackwood's formal seal one final time before setting it carefully aside, already beginning to plan the terms under which she would agree to the requested audience. Send word, she told Priya. Tell them the leader they seek will meet with Blackwood's representatives in 2 weeks' time, on neutral ground of my choosing. And Priya, make certain the location leaves absolutely no room for them to underestimate exactly who they are dealing with. As the camp settled into preparation for the coming meeting, Rain stood alone at the edge of the clearing that night, staring out toward the distant horizon in the direction Blackwood territory lay, feeling 3 years of careful transformation, converging finally toward the confrontation she had both anticipated and quietly dreaded since the moment she first understood the full truth of what had been taken from her. Whatever happened next, she understood with complete certainty that the frightened, discarded Omega who had once walked away from that gathering fire no longer existed. What remained, standing steady and resolute at the edge of her own carefully built kingdom, was someone Blackwood territory had never once expected to encounter again, and someone they were entirely unprepared to face. The meeting hall stood at the exact border between Blackwood territory and the Alliance lands Rain now commanded. A neutral structure built generations earlier specifically for negotiations between wary factions unwilling to meet on either party's home ground. Damien arrived with a small delegation exactly at the appointed hour, his expression carefully composed, despite the unease that had settled over him since receiving the response to his formal request. "Remember," his advisor murmured beside him as they approached the hall's entrance, "whoever leads this alliance now controls trade routes essential to our recovery. Whatever grievances exist, diplomacy must take priority today." Damien nodded absently, his mind still turning over the unsettling discoveries he had made in recent months regarding Garrick's old medical records. Discoveries he had shared with no one, uncertain what to do with suspicions that grew more troubling the longer he examined them. He pushed the thoughts aside as they entered the hall, focusing instead on the negotiations ahead. The hall's interior was simple but dignified, a long table positioned at its center, tall windows allowing afternoon light to spill across polished wooden floors. Damien's delegation took their positions on one side of the table, and for several long minutes, they waited in tense silence for the Alliance's leadership to arrive. When the door at the opposite end finally opened, Damien rose automatically from his seat, following formal protocol for greeting a fellow leader of significant standing. His eyes moved toward the entrance, prepared to greet whatever rogue leader had built the powerful alliance, now commanding such considerable regional influence. The woman who entered stopped him completely. She moved with an authority that filled the entire hall the moment she crossed the threshold, dark hair pulled back neatly, dressed in simple, elegant clothing that carried no pack markings yet somehow commanded more respect than any formal alpha regalia Damien had ever witnessed. Her expression, calm and composed, gave nothing away as her eyes moved across the assembled delegation, settling briefly on each face, before finally, inevitably, meeting his own. Damien's breath caught somewhere deep in his chest, and for a long, disorienting moment, he could not fully process what he was seeing. The features were undeniably familiar, though transformed by years and experience he had no knowledge of, sharper now, more confident, carrying none of the deferential uncertainty he remembered from 7 years earlier. "Elena," he said, the name escaping him before he could stop it, disbelief bleeding into his voice despite his attempt at composure. A ripple of surprise moved through both delegations, at the unexpected familiarity in his tone. The woman standing across the hall did not flinch, did not react visibly to the name at all, her expression remaining perfectly, deliberately composed. "My name," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, calm and utterly unshaken, "is Rain. I believe we have territorial matters to discuss. Alpha Cross." The formal address, delivered with such controlled indifference, struck Damien harder than any accusation could have. 7 years of assuming she had disappeared into rogue territory obscurity, or worse, had not survived at all, collapsed instantly against the reality standing before him now, transformed into someone he barely recognized and yet could not mistake for anyone else. "You," he said, struggling to reconcile the calm, commanding woman before him with the memory of the frightened girl he had cast aside 7 years earlier. "You are the leader behind this alliance, the one they call the rival queen." "I am," Rain confirmed, taking her seat at the head of the opposing delegation with unhurried composure, gesturing for her own advisors to join her. "Shall we proceed with the negotiations you requested, or would you prefer to spend our limited time processing your evident surprise?" The dry precision in her tone sent a ripple of quiet amusement through several members of her delegation, though Rain's own expression remained perfectly composed throughout. Damien felt heat rising to his face, humiliation and shock tangling uncomfortably in his chest, as he forced himself back into his seat, struggling to regain the diplomatic composure the meeting required. "Of course," he managed finally. "Forgive my surprise. I had believed, that is, I had assumed, that I had died somewhere in rogue territory, unmourned and forgotten." Rain finished for him, her tone still perfectly even, though something colder flickered briefly beneath the calm surface. "I understand the assumption. It was, after all, the outcome you clearly expected when you cast me out 7 years ago." The words landed with quiet devastation, delivered without visible anger, without theatrical accusation, simply stated as plain, undeniable fact. Damien's advisors exchanged uncertain glances, clearly recognizing that whatever history existed between their alpha and this powerful new leader ran far deeper than simple territorial negotiation. Elena, Damien began again, quieter this time, the formal negotiation momentarily forgotten entirely. I did not know what you would become. I did not know. You did not know a great many things, Rain interrupted, her voice still calm, but carrying an edge now that silenced him immediately. You did not know that the weakness you condemned me for was never genuine. You did not know that 17 years of my life were shaped by deliberate suppression rather than natural limitation, and you certainly did not care to know any of this 7 years ago, when a simple accusation from your senior elder was apparently sufficient justification for publicly discarding someone who had never once given you reason for such treatment. Damien sat in stunned silence, the accusation striking directly at the discomfort he had been carrying for months since discovering Garrick's suspicious medical records. Suppression, he repeated slowly. You are saying someone deliberately suppressed your abilities. I am saying considerably more than that, Rain said, her gaze steady and unyielding. I am saying that your trusted senior elder, the man whose counsel you apparently still rely upon given his continued position of influence within your pack, orchestrated years of deliberate manipulation to ensure I remained weak enough to justify exactly the kind of public humiliation you delivered so efficiently 7 years ago. The hall fell into heavy silence following her words. Damien's advisor shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly recognizing the delicate, dangerous territory this negotiation had suddenly entered. Damien himself sat frozen, memories of Garrick's careful medical documentation, the vague explanations that had never quite satisfied his growing suspicions, colliding directly with Rain's calm, devastating accusation. I need proof of these claims, Damien said finally, though his voice lacked genuine conviction, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. You need proof, Rain repeated, something sharp flashing briefly in her eyes, before smoothing back into careful composure. 7 years ago, you required no proof whatsoever to condemn me publicly. A single accusation from Garrick was sufficient justification for destroying everything I had ever known. Now that the accusation runs in the opposite direction, suddenly proof becomes necessary. Damien had no adequate response to that. The truth of her observation sat heavily in the silence between them, undeniable and thoroughly damning. I did not come here today to relitigate what happened 7 years ago, Rain continued, her tone shifting back toward formal composure, though something colder remained beneath the surface now. I came to discuss the territorial trade disputes you formally requested audience to resolve. Whatever else exists between us can be addressed separately, if you choose to pursue it at all. The remaining hour of negotiations proceeded with careful, formal precision, both parties working through the trade route disputes with the professional detachment diplomatic circumstances required. Rain proved as skilled a negotiator as her reputation suggested, securing favorable terms for the alliance, while offering Blackwood concessions, generous enough to suggest she held no interest in deliberately punishing them through the negotiation itself, whatever personal history existed beneath the formal proceedings. As the meeting drew to its conclusion and both delegations began preparing to depart, Damien found himself lingering near the hall's entrance, watching Rain finalize details with her advisors, struggling to reconcile 7 years of assumptions with the powerful, composed woman standing before him now. Rain, he said finally, approaching her as her advisors moved ahead toward the exit, giving them a brief moment of relative privacy. Whatever you believe about what happened 7 years ago, I need you to know that I have spent considerable time recently questioning Garrick's counsel and motivations. If what you are suggesting proves true, if, Rain repeated quietly, cutting him off, though her voice carried more weariness now than anger. 7 years, Damien. 7 years I spent believing myself worthless, because you and everyone around you decided that assessment required no further examination. Do not expect me to be moved by belated questioning that arrives only after I have built enough power to make my accusations impossible to simply dismiss. The words carried no theatrical cruelty, simply plain, exhausted truth, and Damien felt the full weight of what he had cost her settling over him, with an intensity he had spent 7 years successfully avoiding. I am sorry, he said quietly, the words feeling entirely insufficient, even as he spoke them. Rain studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her, carefully composed expression. grief and anger, and something else. Something almost like remembered affection, buried deep beneath years of hard-won strength. "Sorry does not undo 7 years," she said finally. "But perhaps, if your questioning of Garrick's counsel proves genuine, rather than convenient, it might eventually mean something." She turned then, following her advisors out of the hall without waiting for further response, leaving Damien standing alone in the fading afternoon light. The formal negotiations concluded successfully, but something far more significant left entirely, painfully unresolved between them. Damien rode back toward Blackwood territory in near silence, his advisors exchanging occasional uncertain glances, but wisely choosing not to press him for explanation regarding the clearly personal history that had surfaced so unexpectedly during the negotiations. By the time they crossed back onto familiar land, the sun had begun sinking low toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange that reminded him uncomfortably of the gathering fire 7 years earlier. He went directly to his study upon returning, pulling out the old medical records he had discovered months earlier, spreading them across his desk once again, with fresh, urgent purpose. Rain's accusations, delivered with such calm, devastating certainty, had transformed his lingering suspicions into something far more concrete, something demanding immediate confrontation rather than continued quiet examination. He summoned Garrick to his study within the hour, unwilling to allow another night to pass without addressing directly what he now suspected had shaped 7 years of decisions, built on a foundation of deliberate deception. "You wish to see me, Alpha," Garrick said upon entering, his tone carrying the same practiced deference as always, though Damien now studied him with considerably sharper scrutiny than he had ever applied before. "I met with the leader of the Eastern Alliance today," Damien said, watching Garrick's expression carefully as he spoke. "The one they call the Rival Queen." Something flickered briefly across Garrick's composed features, quickly masked, but not quickly enough to escape Damien's attention. "I trust the negotiations proceeded favorably." "The negotiations proceeded quite well," Damien said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the anger building steadily beneath the surface. "Though I found the leader herself considerably more familiar than expected." "Would you care to guess why, Garrick?" Garrick's careful composure held, but Damien noticed the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the subtle shift in his posture that suggested genuine unease beneath the practiced exterior. "I could not begin to guess, Alpha." "Her name is Elena," Damien said flatly, watching every flicker of reaction cross Garrick's face with new, unforgiving attention. "Though she goes by Rain now, I imagine that name means considerably more to you than you would prefer to admit." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, Garrick's expression cycling through several careful calculations before settling into something colder, more guarded than Damien had ever witnessed from the elder in all his years of service to Blackwood. "The Omega girl," Garrick said finally, his voice carrying a careful neutrality that felt entirely deliberate now, rehearsed rather than genuine. "I confess considerable surprise that she survived rogue territory, let alone rose to such prominence." "Surprise," Damien repeated slowly, "or concern that a decision you orchestrated years ago has finally returned to threaten the position you have carefully protected ever since?" Garrick's expression finally cracked, just slightly, revealing something colder and more calculating beneath the careful mask he had maintained for decades. "I do not understand your meaning, Alpha." "I found the medical records, Garrick," Damien said, his voice hardening with each word. "Years of treatments you personally documented, beginning when Elena was barely 6 years old, stopping abruptly, right around the time her supposed weakness became firmly established within this pack's perception. I want to know exactly what those treatments were, and I want to know exactly why you have spent 17 years ensuring nobody, including me, ever questioned their true purpose." For a long, tense moment, Garrick said nothing at all, his careful composure warring visibly with something far more calculating happening behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice had shifted entirely, shedding the deferential tone he had maintained for decades, revealing something colder and considerably more dangerous underneath. "You should be thanking me," Garrick said quietly, "rather than questioning decisions that protected this pack's future considerably more effectively than you currently understand." Damien felt something cold settle deep into his chest at the elder's sudden, unguarded honesty. "Protected this pack's future from what exactly?" Garrick studied him for a long moment, seeming to weigh how much truth the situation now demanded. From a bloodline considerably more powerful than anything Blackwood's own lineage could match, he said finally. The girl carried prime blood, Alpha, buried so deep, even she did not recognize it herself as a child. Left unchecked, that bloodline would have eventually overshadowed your own claim to leadership entirely, regardless of the mate bond fate had assigned between you. The confirmation, delivered so plainly after 17 years of careful concealment, struck Damien with the force of a physical blow. You suppressed her natural abilities, he said slowly, disbelief and fury tangling together in his voice, to protect my position as future Alpha. To protect this pack's stability, Garrick corrected sharply. A prime bloodline rising unchecked beside an ordinary Alpha lineage would have inevitably shifted the balance of power in ways this pack was not prepared to accommodate. I made a difficult decision 17 years ago, and I stand by its necessity even now, regardless of how uncomfortable the truth has apparently become for you today. Damien stared at the elder who had guided pack decisions for decades, feeling the full weight of 17 years of manipulation settling over him with sickening clarity. Every insult hurled at Elena throughout her childhood, every dismissive comment, every carefully orchestrated moment of humiliation, all of it traced directly back to a decision made without her knowledge or consent, purely to protect a position of influence Garrick had never been willing to risk losing. "Get out of my study," Damien said quietly, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "We will discuss the consequences of your 17 years of deception soon enough, Garrick, but not tonight." Garrick studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his calculating eyes, before turning and leaving, without further argument, though his composed exit did nothing to diminish the cold, dangerous certainty that had finally replaced decades of careful deference. Alone in his study once more, Damien sank into his chair, staring at the scattered medical records spread across his desk. 17 years of accumulated deception finally laid bare before him. He thought of Elena's transformed face across the negotiation table earlier that day, calm and composed, and utterly unwilling to be moved by his belated apology. He understood now, with painful clarity, exactly how thoroughly he had failed her, and exactly how much work remained ahead, if he ever hoped to earn back even a fraction of the trust he had so carelessly destroyed 7 years earlier. In the weeks following the tense negotiation, Damien found reasons to request additional meetings with Rain's alliance, ostensibly to finalize remaining details of their trade agreement, though both parties understood the deeper motivation driving his repeated visits. Rain agreed to each request with careful, professional distance, never refusing outright, but never offering the warmth or familiarity Damien clearly hoped might gradually return between them. "You keep finding reasons to visit," she observed, during their third meeting, reviewing shipping route documents with the same measured focus she applied to every aspect of alliance business. "The trade terms were finalized 2 meetings ago, Damien." "I know," he admitted, setting aside the pretense of formal business for a moment. "I keep hoping that if I show up enough times, prove through consistency what words alone clearly cannot, you might eventually believe I am genuinely trying to make amends, rather than simply managing political convenience." Rain studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her carefully guarded expression. "Consistency matters," she acknowledged finally. "But Damien, 7 years of dismissal cannot be undone through several weeks of belated attention, however genuine your intentions may currently be." "I confronted Garrick," Damien said quietly. "He confirmed everything. The suppression, the deliberate manipulation, all of it, exactly as you described during our first meeting." Something flickered across Rain's expression at this, surprise quickly masked by careful composure. "And what have you done with that confirmation?" "I have begun a formal investigation," Damien said, "reviewing every decision Garrick has influenced over the past 2 decades, searching for other instances where his counsel may have caused similar harm. I owe you considerably more than words, Elena. I intend to ensure the truth becomes fully known throughout the pack, regardless of what that exposure costs my own standing as Alpha." Rain considered this for a long moment, weighing his words against 7 years of accumulated distrust. "That is a start," she said finally, careful neutrality still coloring her voice, though something slightly warmer had crept beneath the surface. "But Damien, I have spent 3 years building an alliance that depends entirely on my judgment being trusted without hesitation. I cannot simply forgive what happened because you have finally decided to question the man responsible for engineering it. I understand, Damien said. I am not asking for forgiveness, not yet. I am simply asking for the opportunity to prove, through consistent action rather than empty apology, that I am genuinely committed to making this right. Meanwhile, as Damien pursued his investigation within Blackwood territory, Rain directed her own resources toward uncovering the full scope of Garrick's manipulations. She sent Priya and several trusted advisors to quietly investigate records from neighboring territories, searching for any pattern suggesting Elena's suppression had not been an isolated incident. The results, when they arrived several weeks later, proved considerably more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Priya returned from her investigation with documentation of at least 3 other cases spanning nearly 2 decades, young wolves from various territories whose unusual bloodlines had been quietly suppressed or discredited through Garrick's careful intervention, each case bearing striking similarities to Elena's own experience. He has been doing this for years, Priya reported, spreading the gathered documentation across Rain's private quarters. Whenever a bloodline emerged strong enough to potentially threaten established power structures, Garrick found ways to intervene, sometimes through direct suppression like what happened to you, sometimes through more subtle manipulation, designed to discredit and marginalize before the individual ever understood their true potential. Rain studied the documentation carefully, cold fury building steadily beneath her controlled exterior, as she absorbed the full scope of what Garrick had orchestrated over decades of careful, patient manipulation. Why? She asked quietly. What does he gain from suppressing bloodlines that threaten established power structures? Influence, Corvin said, entering the room and studying the scattered documents with grim understanding. An elder's position depends entirely on the stability of whatever hierarchy currently exists. A prime bloodline rising unchecked would inevitably reshape that hierarchy, potentially displacing advisors like Garrick, who have built their entire influence around navigating and manipulating a specific power structure. By suppressing threats before they fully emerge, he ensures his own continued relevance and control. The explanation, cold and calculated as it was, made a disturbing kind of sense. Rain thought of Garrick's satisfaction at the gathering fire 7 years earlier, understanding now that his pleasure had never been about protecting Blackwood's interests at all, but purely about eliminating a threat to his own carefully constructed influence. We need to expose this fully, she said, determination hardening her voice. Not just for my own sake, but for every other wolf whose potential he has stolen through similar manipulation. Word of the growing investigation eventually reached Garrick himself, whether through careful monitoring of Damien's activities within Blackwood, or through his own network of informants scattered throughout the region. Understanding that exposure now seemed increasingly inevitable, the elder began taking desperate measures to protect himself, reaching out quietly to contacts among the very coalition that had attacked Rain's allied territory months earlier. He is meeting with remnants of Torin's old rivals, a scout reported to Rain's camp several weeks into the investigation. The same coalition that attacked our eastern border. It appears Garrick intends to weaponize their resentment toward your growing influence, offering information and resources in exchange for their assistance in eliminating you before your investigation can be completed. The news landed with grim, unsurprising weight. Garrick, cornered and increasingly desperate, had apparently decided that direct confrontation offered better odds than allowing the truth to fully surface and destroy decades of carefully constructed influence. How much time do we have? Rain asked, already calculating strategic responses to this new threat. Difficult to say precisely, the scout admitted, but the coalition has begun gathering additional fighters over the past several weeks. Whatever Garrick is planning, it appears imminent rather than distant. Rain called an immediate strategy meeting, gathering Corvin, Priya, and her most trusted allied leaders to assess the growing threat. The room fell into focused, urgent discussion as reports were compared, defensive positions evaluated, potential timelines debated with the same careful strategic precision that had guided every major decision throughout the Alliance's 3 years of steady growth. We should warn Damien, Priya suggested during the discussion. If Garrick is willing to ally with hostile forces against you, there is no telling what desperate measures he might also attempt against Blackwood's own leadership, particularly given how directly threatening Damien's investigation has become to his continued position. Rain considered this seriously, weighing old grievances against practical necessity. Whatever remained unresolved between herself and Damien personally, the growing threat Garrick now posed extended well beyond their individual history, potentially endangering both territories if left unaddressed. "Send word," she said finally. "Formal warning of the threat, along with an invitation to coordinate defensive strategy, should Blackwood's leadership choose to accept it." The message reached Damien within days, delivered through the same formal diplomatic channels that had governed their earlier negotiations. He read through Rain's careful warning with growing alarm, understanding immediately the full implications of Garrick's desperate alliance with hostile coalition forces. He called an emergency council meeting within Blackwood's leadership that same evening, presenting the gathered evidence of Garrick's decades of manipulation, alongside the fresh warning of his current dangerous alliance. The revelation sent shockwaves through Blackwood's assembled leadership, decades of trust in the senior elders' council, collapsing rapidly beneath the weight of accumulated evidence. "He must be confronted immediately," one senior pack member insisted, outrage clear in his voice, "before he can complete whatever scheme he currently pursues against either territory." Damien agreed, though something more personal drove his urgency beyond simple political necessity. Whatever Garrick intended against Rain's growing alliance represented a direct continuation of the same manipulation that had already cost Elena 17 years of her rightful strength and 7 additional years of unjust exile. He would not stand by passively, while the elder attempted to compound that damage further. "We move against him tonight," Damien decided, "before he has further opportunity to coordinate with hostile forces, and before whatever plan he has constructed can proceed any further toward completion." As Blackwood's leadership began organizing their response, messengers were dispatched to inform Rain's alliance of their intended actions, establishing the foundation for coordinated defense against the threat both territories now understood they faced together, regardless of the painful history that had once divided them so completely. That night, as preparations moved forward on both sides, Rain stood once again at the edge of her camp, staring out toward the horizon where Blackwood territory lay, feeling the careful balance of power she had spent 3 years building begin shifting toward a confrontation neither she nor Damien had fully anticipated when their paths crossed again weeks earlier. Whatever came next, she understood, with growing certainty, that the reckoning she had long promised herself, the moment when the truth of Garrick's manipulation would finally be fully exposed and addressed, had arrived considerably sooner and under far more dangerous circumstances than she had originally anticipated. Miles from Blackwood territory, in a hidden camp tucked deep within contested borderlands, Garrick met with the remaining leaders of the coalition that had once attempted to crush Rain's Eastern Alliance before it could fully establish itself. The coalition's surviving leader, a sharp-eyed woman named Vesna who had inherited command after Torin's public defeat months earlier, studied Garrick with open suspicion, despite the valuable information he had already provided. "You want us to move against the rival queen directly," Vesna said, her tone skeptical. "The same leader who defeated Torin decisively and repelled our coordinated assault on her eastern border without significant losses. Forgive me if I question the wisdom of a second attempt." "The second attempt will not fail like the first," Garrick assured her, though something increasingly desperate had crept into his usually controlled demeanor over recent weeks. "I possess detailed knowledge of her defensive arrangements, troop movements, and most critically, personal vulnerabilities she has taken considerable care to keep hidden from the wider region." Vesna's expression remained skeptical, but calculating interest flickered behind her sharp eyes. "What personal vulnerabilities?" Garrick hesitated only briefly before answering. Decades of careful discretion finally giving way to desperate necessity. Her connection to Blackwood territory runs deeper than public knowledge suggests. If that connection can be exploited correctly, timed precisely alongside a coordinated assault, her attention and resources will be divided at exactly the moment your forces require maximum advantage. "And what do you gain from providing this information?" Vesna pressed, unwilling to commit resources without clear understanding of Garrick's own motivations. "Stability," Garrick said simply. "The continuation of proper order within regional power structures, rather than the chaotic redistribution of influence her rising alliance threatens to create. I have spent decades ensuring Blackwood's position remains secure against exactly this kind of disruptive influence, and I do not intend to watch that work unravel now." Vesna studied him for a long, calculating moment before finally nodding, though wariness remained evident in her sharp gaze. Very well. We will move against her within the fortnight, using the intelligence you provide. But understand, Garrick, if your information proves faulty, or your motivations more self-serving than you currently admit, you will find our coalition considerably less forgiving than the rival queen herself has proven toward her enemies. Garrick accepted the warning with careful composure, though privately, the threat barely registered against the far greater danger he currently faced from Damien's growing investigation back in Blackwood territory. Decades of carefully constructed influence teetered now on the edge of complete collapse, and desperate circumstances, he had long ago concluded, required correspondingly desperate measures. As the coalition began finalizing their strategic plans for the coming assault, Garrick slipped quietly away from the hidden camp, beginning the long journey back toward Blackwood territory, already calculating how best to manage Damien's mounting suspicions, while the coalition's attack proceeded according to plan. Whatever the outcome of the coming confrontation, he intended to ensure his own position remained protected, regardless of what cost that protection ultimately demanded from others. Back within Blackwood territory, Damien's investigation continued expanding with each passing day, uncovering additional evidence of Garrick's decades of careful manipulation. Pack members who had previously hesitated to speak openly against the influential elder began coming forward, once assured of Damien's genuine commitment to uncovering the full truth, sharing accounts of subtle intimidation, quietly discredited rivals, and strategic misinformation that had shaped countless pack decisions over the years. The pattern extends further than we initially realized, Damien's advisor reported during one particularly revealing council session. At least 6 other pack members over the past 2 decades experienced treatment remarkably similar to what happened to Elena. Careful discrediting, engineered isolation, gradual marginalization, until their potential influence within the pack was effectively neutralized. Damien absorbed this information with growing horror, understanding now the full scope of damage Garrick's decades of careful manipulation had inflicted, not merely on Elena, but on the entire pack's development and stability. Talented individuals who might have strengthened Blackwood considerably had instead been systematically suppressed, their potential contributions lost entirely to protect one elder's carefully guarded influence. We need physical evidence sufficient for formal pack tribunal, Damien said, determination hardening his resolve further with each new revelation. Testimony alone may not prove sufficient against someone who has spent decades cultivating trust and careful deniability. The investigation continued through the following days, evidence accumulating steadily as Damien's team worked to build an irrefutable case against the elder who had shaped so many crucial decisions throughout Blackwood's recent history. Meanwhile, unaware of how close his exposure had truly become, Garrick returned to his usual duties within the pack, maintaining careful appearances while quietly awaiting the coalition's coordinated strike against Rain's alliance. Tension built steadily on both fronts as the days passed, Rain's alliance preparing defensive strategies against the anticipated coalition assault, while Damien's investigation moved steadily closer to formal confrontation with Garrick's decades of accumulated deception. Both leaders understood, through the careful diplomatic channels now regularly connecting their territories, that the coming days would likely determine not only the fate of Garrick's long-hidden manipulations, but potentially the future relationship between their 2 territories as well. Everything we have built, Rain said quietly to Corvin, reviewing defensive preparations late one evening, as the anticipated timeline for coalition action grew increasingly urgent. Every alliance, every careful negotiation, all of it, now depends on how we handle the confrontation ahead. You have prepared for this moment for 3 years, Corvin reminded her, steady confidence coloring his weathered voice. Whatever Garrick and his desperate coalition allies attempt, you no longer face it as the frightened girl who once walked away from Blackwood's gathering fire. You face it as exactly who you have become, surrounded by allies who trust your leadership completely. Rain nodded, drawing strength from his words even as the weight of the coming confrontation settled heavily across her shoulders. Whatever happened in the days ahead, she understood clearly now that the reckoning she had long anticipated, the moment when Garrick's decades of manipulation would finally collide directly with the consequences of his actions, had arrived at last, carrying stakes far higher than she had ever originally anticipated when she first left Corvin's camp 3 years earlier, as the newly named Rain. Damien called for a formal pack tribunal on a gray morning, 10 days after Garrick's secret meeting with the coalition. The Great Hall filled to capacity with pack members summoned to witness proceedings that would determine the fate of the elder who had shaped Blackwood's decisions for nearly 3 decades. Garrick entered the hall with his usual composed dignity, apparently still unaware of how thoroughly his activities had been uncovered, though something wary flickered behind his eyes as he took in the unusually large gathering. "Alpha," he greeted Damien formally, settling into the seat traditionally reserved for the pack's senior elder during tribunal proceedings. "I confess some confusion regarding the purpose of today's gathering." "The confusion will not last long," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. He gestured to his advisor, who began presenting the accumulated evidence methodically, starting with the medical records documenting Elena's childhood suppression, moving through testimony gathered from 6 other pack members who had experienced similar manipulation, and concluding with recent reports of Garrick's secret meeting with hostile coalition forces, actively planning an assault against a neighboring alliance. The hall fell into stunned, horrified silence as the full scope of Garrick's decades of manipulation was laid bare before the assembled pack. Members who had trusted his counsel for years stared at him with dawning horror, understanding now how thoroughly his influence had shaped decisions they had never thought to question. Garrick's composed exterior finally cracked completely under the weight of such comprehensive exposure. "You do not understand what you are dismantling," he said, his voice rising with genuine desperation now, all pretense of careful deference abandoned entirely. "Everything I have done, every difficult decision, was made to protect this pack's stability against threats you clearly still fail to fully comprehend." "You suppressed an innocent child's natural abilities," Damien said, fury barely contained beneath his measured tone. "Engineered her public humiliation and exile, and when your decades of manipulation finally faced exposure, you allied yourself with hostile forces, actively planning violence against her current territory. Explain to this assembled pack exactly how any of that constitutes protecting Blackwood's stability." Garrick had no adequate response to offer. He sat in tense silence as the tribunal proceeded, pack members voting unanimously to strip him of his position and standing within Blackwood territory, effective immediately, pending further consequences still to be determined regarding his ongoing alliance with hostile coalition forces. As guards moved to escort the disgraced elder from the hall, Garrick turned back toward Damien one final time, something cold and calculating replacing the desperation that had briefly cracked his composure. "The coalition moves against her alliance, regardless of what happens to me here today," he said quietly, just loud enough for Damien to hear clearly. "Whatever satisfaction you find in today's proceedings, understand that the true consequences of exposing me have already been set irreversibly into motion." The words landed with chilling weight. Damien felt cold urgency replace his earlier satisfaction as the implications settled fully into place. Garrick's exposure, however necessary and deserved, had done nothing to halt the coalition assault already planned against Rain's territory, an assault that, according to Garrick's earlier warning, could strike at any moment. "Send word immediately," Damien instructed his advisor, already moving toward preparations for whatever response the situation now urgently demanded. "Alert Rain's alliance that the coalition threat remains active, regardless of Garrick's exposure here today, and begin organizing whatever forces we can mobilize to assist in their defense." Word reached Rain's camp within hours, delivered by an exhausted messenger who had ridden through the night to ensure the warning arrived as quickly as possible. Rain received the news with grim, focused determination, understanding immediately that Garrick's public exposure, whatever justice it represented, had done nothing to eliminate the more immediate physical threat still gathering against her alliance. "How much time do we have?" she asked Priya, who had been monitoring coalition movements closely throughout the preceding days. "Scouts report significant troop movement toward our eastern border beginning this morning," Priya said grimly. "Based on their pace and formation, I would estimate less than 2 days before they reach striking distance." Rain absorbed this information with the same calm, strategic focus that had guided her through every major crisis over the preceding 3 years, though something more personal underlaid her determination this time. Knowledge that Garrick's desperate final gambit had been specifically designed to exploit her connection to Blackwood territory in ways that could prove genuinely dangerous, if not addressed with careful precision. Gather every Allied leader within reasonable travel distance, she instructed. We need coordinated defense established before the coalition arrives, and we need it organized quickly enough to account for whatever exploitation Garrick may have specifically designed against our defensive weaknesses. As preparations began moving forward with urgent efficiency throughout her camp, Rain found herself, in a rare quiet moment, considering the strange, complicated trajectory that had brought her to this point. 7 years earlier, she had been cast aside as worthless, humiliated publicly, by the very man whose territory now scrambled to provide urgent warning and assistance against a threat orchestrated by the same elder who had once engineered her downfall. Corvin found her standing alone at the edge of camp that evening, staring out toward the direction the coalition forces were reportedly approaching from, her expression carrying the weight of everything the coming confrontation represented. "You are thinking about him," Corvin observed quietly, understanding immediately, without needing further explanation. "I am thinking about how strange it is," Rain admitted, "that the same territory which once discarded me so completely now sends urgent warning to help protect what I have built since then. 7 years ago, I could not have imagined circumstances that would bring Damian Cross to genuinely fight for my survival, rather than dismiss it entirely. People change," Corvin said simply, "sometimes through genuine growth, sometimes through painful confrontation with consequences they spent years avoiding. Whether Damian's change proves genuine and lasting remains to be seen, but his warning today, at considerable political risk to his own recently stabilized position, suggests something more than simple political convenience motivating his actions." Rain considered this carefully, old grief and cautious hope tangling uncomfortably beneath her composed exterior. "Whatever his motivations," she said finally, "right now, my priority must remain protecting everyone who has trusted my leadership over these past 3 years. Whatever remains unresolved between myself and Damian will need to wait until this immediate threat has been properly addressed." Corvin nodded, respecting the boundary she had drawn even as his weathered expression suggested he recognized more complexity brewing beneath her carefully maintained composure than she was currently willing to fully acknowledge. As night fell fully over the camp, preparations continued with focused urgency, Allied leaders arriving steadily throughout the evening to coordinate defensive strategy against the coming coalition assault. Whatever old wounds remained between Rain and Blackwood territory, whatever new truths had emerged through Garrick's public exposure and subsequent desperate final gambit, the immediate reality facing everyone gathered that night demanded complete focus on the confrontation now bearing down rapidly upon them, a confrontation that would test everything Rain had built over 3 years of careful, deliberate transformation. Damian arrived at Rain's camp himself the following morning, leading a contingent of Blackwood's most capable fighters, having decided the warning alone was insufficient, given the personal responsibility he felt for the danger Garrick's exposure had ultimately unleashed. Rain met him at the camp's perimeter, surprise flickering briefly across her composed expression at the sight of the Alpha, personally leading reinforcements, rather than simply dispatching them under lesser command. "I did not expect you to come yourself," she said, studying him carefully, as his fighters began coordinating with her own defensive preparations, under Priya's efficient direction. "Garrick's final threat exists because of what I exposed," Damian said simply. "I could not in good conscience send fighters to address a danger my own actions ultimately triggered, while remaining safely removed from the consequences myself." Rain considered this, something shifting slightly in her guarded expression, though she said nothing further as they walked together toward the central command area, where Allied leaders continued finalizing defensive strategy for the coming confrontation. They spent the remainder of that day deep in strategic planning, coordinating troop positions, reviewing scout reports detailing the coalition's approach, and establishing communication protocols between the various Allied territories now gathering to defend against the anticipated assault. Working alongside each other for the first time since their painful reunion weeks earlier, Damian found himself genuinely impressed by the strategic clarity and calm authority Rain brought to every decision, qualities that had clearly developed considerably beyond anything Blackwood had ever recognized or valued during her years there as an overlooked Omega. As evening settled over the camp and the immediate planning session concluded, Damian found Rain alone once more at the edge of the clearing, staring out toward the direction the coalition forces continued approaching from. "May I speak with you?" he asked quietly, "about something other than tomorrow's battle?" Rain turned to face him, weariness and cautious wariness mingling in her expression. If this concerns apologies, Damien, I have already told you that words alone cannot undo 7 years of harm. It is not an apology, he said. Or rather, it is not only that. I wanted you to understand something. I have come to realize over these past several weeks, watching everything you have built, everything you have become, since I so carelessly discarded you. Rain said nothing, waiting with careful, guarded attention as he continued. 7 years ago, Damien said slowly, I told myself I was protecting Blackwood's future by ending our bond. I convinced myself that decision reflected sound judgment rather than simple cowardice, an unwillingness to question an elder's counsel I had been raised to trust without hesitation. But watching you now, watching everything you have accomplished despite, or perhaps even because of, the injustice done to you, I understand clearly that the weakness that night belonged entirely to me, not to you. I know, Rain said quietly, though something in her voice suggested his acknowledgement carried more weight than she had perhaps expected it to. I am not asking you to forget what happened, Damien continued. I am not even asking for forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, depending on how you choose to move forward from here. I simply needed you to hear directly from me that I understand fully now exactly what I cost you, and exactly how much stronger and more capable you proved yourself to be, despite everything I took from you. Rain studied him for a long moment in the fading evening light, 7 years of accumulated grief and anger, warring quietly with the genuine remorse she could see clearly in his expression now, remorse that felt considerably different from the careful political apology he had offered during their earlier negotiations. Tomorrow, she said finally, we face a genuine threat together, one that exists partly because of consequences neither of us fully anticipated when Garrick's manipulation finally came to light. Let us focus on surviving that confrontation successfully. Whatever exists between us beyond that, whatever reconciliation or continued distance ultimately proves appropriate, we can address once this immediate danger has passed. Damien nodded, accepting the boundary she had drawn without argument, understanding that her willingness to even engage this openly represented more progress than he had genuinely expected given everything that stood between them. Thank you, he said quietly, for allowing me to say that much, even if nothing more comes from it. Rain offered no direct response, but something in her expression, a slight softening around eyes that had remained carefully guarded throughout their previous encounters, suggested his words had landed somewhere genuine beneath her careful composure. They stood together in silence for several long moments, watching the last light fade from the sky above the gathering camp, both keenly aware that whatever tentative progress had occurred between them tonight would soon be tested against the far more immediate and dangerous reality awaiting them with tomorrow's dawn. Rest tonight if you can, Rain said finally, turning back toward the main camp. Tomorrow will demand everything each of us has to offer, regardless of what remains unresolved between us personally. Damien watched her walk away, feeling something complicated settle into his chest, equal parts renewed hope and clear-eyed understanding that whatever future existed between them, if any future existed at all, would need to be built slowly and carefully, earned through consistent action, rather than assumed through old bonds that had already proven, once devastatingly, how easily they could be broken. As the camp settled into its final preparations before the coming confrontation, both leaders retreated to their respective quarters, each carrying the weight of old wounds and new understanding into whatever the coming dawn would ultimately bring. The coalition forces struck at dawn, exactly as scout reports had predicted, emerging from the tree line along the eastern border in coordinated waves that immediately tested the defensive positions Rain's alliance had spent the preceding 2 days establishing. Vesna led the assault personally, her forces significantly bolstered by additional fighters recruited through Garrick's earlier promises of resources and strategic intelligence. They are moving faster than anticipated, Priya reported urgently, finding Rain already positioned at the front lines, coordinating defensive formations with the calm, focused precision 3 years of leadership had cultivated within her. Eastern flank is under heaviest pressure. Then we reinforce the eastern flank, Rain said, already moving toward the position under greatest threat, Damien falling into step beside her without hesitation, his own fighters coordinating seamlessly with her allied forces, despite the relatively short time they had spent training together. The battle that followed tested every strategic and physical capability Rain had developed since her transformation began 3 years earlier. She moved through the chaos of combat with controlled precision, directing her forces while personally engaging threats that emerged directly in her path. The prime bloodline strength she had spent years learning to control, now flowing through her with practiced, deliberate purpose, rather than the uncertain surges she had first experienced against the rogue scouts near Corvin's camp. Vesna herself eventually emerged directly opposite Rain's position, cutting through defensive lines with brutal efficiency, clearly seeking direct confrontation with the Alliance leader, whose reputation had already cost her forces so dearly during the earlier encounter with Tauren months before. "You cost us significant standing when you defeated Tauren," Vesna said, circling Rain warily as their forces continued clashing around them. "This time, I intend to ensure that particular humiliation does not repeat itself." "You are welcome to try," Rain answered evenly, already reading the subtle tension in Vesna's stance, the careful positioning that suggested considerable combat experience rather than mere aggressive bravado. Their confrontation began immediately, both fighters testing each other's capabilities through careful initial exchanges before the pace inevitably accelerated into something far more intense. Vesna proved a considerably more skilled opponent than Tauren had been, her attacks calculated and precise rather than relying on brute strength alone, forcing Rain to draw deeply on every lesson Corvin had painstakingly instilled throughout their years of training together. Nearby, Damien fought his own series of engagements, coordinating Blackwood's fighters alongside Rain's allied forces with a competence that surprised several of her advisors who had initially doubted whether Blackwood's contribution would prove genuinely valuable rather than merely symbolic. He fought with focused determination, aware that every fighter he successfully repelled represented one less threat capable of reaching Rain's position, one less danger that might otherwise exploit whatever personal vulnerability Garrick had specifically designed the assault around. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though in reality, barely 30 minutes had passed before the coalition's initial momentum began faltering under the Alliance's coordinated defense. Rain's strategic preparations, combined with the additional strength Damien's forces provided, proved considerably more resilient than Vesna's forces had anticipated, based on Garrick's earlier assurances. "Your information proved less reliable than promised," Rain observed, during a brief lull in her ongoing confrontation with Vesna, both fighters breathing hard, circling each other warily as they assessed the battle's broader trajectory unfolding around them. "Garrick assured us your defenses would be divided, distracted by internal conflict with Blackwood territory," Vesna admitted, frustration evident in her voice as she recognized the assault's diminishing prospects for success. "Instead, you have somehow united with the very territory he claimed would provide exploitable weakness." The observation, delivered with genuine confusion, confirmed exactly what Rain had suspected regarding Garrick's specific strategic calculations. He had assumed her connection to Damien and Blackwood would create division and vulnerability, rather than unexpected strength, a miscalculation that had ultimately doomed the coalition's assault before it had ever truly begun. Their confrontation resumed with renewed intensity, both fighters pushing themselves to their absolute limits as the broader battle continued shifting decisively in favor of the defending alliance around them. Rain drew deeply on the full extent of her prime bloodline strength, moving with a combination of speed and precision that gradually began overwhelming Vesna's considerable, but ultimately more conventional combat training. The confrontation reached its conclusion when Rain finally found the opening she had been patiently working to create throughout their extended exchange, sidestepping a committed strike and driving a decisive counter that left Vesna disarmed and off balance, unable to prevent the final hold that brought their confrontation to a definitive end. "Yield," Rain said, echoing the same demand she had once made of Tauren, though the circumstances now carried considerably higher stakes than that earlier, more contained contest had involved. Vesna, recognizing the futility of continued resistance, yielded with visible frustration, and word of her defeat spread rapidly through the remaining coalition forces still engaged elsewhere across the battlefield. Without their leader's continued direction, coalition resistance began collapsing rapidly, fighters retreating in increasingly disorganized fashion as the Alliance's coordinated defense pressed their advantage decisively. Within the hour, the coalition assault had been thoroughly repelled, remaining forces withdrawing entirely from the contested border region, leaving behind clear, undeniable proof that Garrick's desperate final gambit had failed as thoroughly as every other manipulation he had orchestrated throughout his decades of careful, hidden influence. As the battlefield gradually quieted, Rain moved through the aftermath, checking on her fighters, coordinating medical attention for those injured during the extended confrontation, the exhausted but genuine satisfaction of successful defense settling steadily over the camp despite the physical toll the battle had exacted from everyone involved. She found Damien near the eastern perimeter, tending to a shallow wound along his forearm, while overseeing the final withdrawal of coalition forces from the immediate area. He looked up as she approached, exhaustion evident in his expression but also something else, a kind of quiet satisfaction that mirrored her own relief at the battle's successful conclusion. "Your forces fought well," Rain said, genuine acknowledgement coloring her voice despite the careful distance she had maintained throughout their recent interactions. "They fought alongside allies who deserved every effort we could offer," Damien said, meeting her gaze steadily. "Whatever remains unresolved between our territories personally, today proved clearly that Blackwood and your alliance share considerably more common ground than either of us perhaps expected when this began." Rain considered this, watching the last of the coalition forces disappear back into the distant tree line, the immediate crisis finally, definitively resolved. "Garrick's final gambit failed completely," she said. "Whatever damage he intended to inflict through this assault, instead it demonstrated only how thoroughly his calculations about my supposed vulnerabilities had already become outdated." "He miscalculated everything," Damien agreed. "Your strength, your alliance's resilience, and perhaps most significantly, his assumption that connecting our territories would create weakness, rather than genuine strength." They stood together in comfortable, exhausted silence for several long moments, watching medical teams move efficiently through the aftermath, tending to injured fighters from both territories with the same careful attention, regardless of which banner they had fought under during the confrontation. "I need to ask you something," Rain said finally, turning to face him directly. "During the battle, you positioned yourself repeatedly to intercept threats approaching my location, even when doing so meant leaving your own fighters temporarily less coordinated. Why?" Damien considered the question seriously before answering. "Because whatever history exists between us, whatever damage I caused 7 years ago, I understood clearly today that protecting you mattered more to me than any lingering political calculation or personal pride. I did not fight beside you today out of obligation, Rain. I fought beside you because somewhere over these past several weeks, watching everything you have built and everything you have become, I realized I genuinely care what happens to you, considerably beyond simple diplomatic necessity." The admission, delivered with quiet, genuine honesty rather than any calculated attempt at reconciliation, settled into the space between them with unexpected weight. Rain studied him carefully. 7 years of carefully guarded distrust warring against the accumulating evidence of genuine change she had witnessed throughout their recent interactions, culminating now in his demonstrated willingness to risk himself directly on her behalf during today's confrontation. "I am not ready to forget what happened 7 years ago," she said finally, honesty replacing careful diplomatic distance. "But I am beginning to understand that perhaps holding on to that grief indefinitely serves no purpose beyond punishing us both unnecessarily for decisions that, however devastating, were ultimately shaped by Garrick's manipulation rather than genuine malice on your part." "That is more than I expected to hear," Damien admitted quietly. "Do not mistake this for forgiveness," Rain cautioned, though something warmer had crept into her tone despite her careful qualification. "It is simply an acknowledgement that perhaps, given time and continued consistency, something beyond mere professional cooperation might eventually prove possible between us again." Damien nodded, understanding the significance of what she offered even within its careful limitations, recognizing that whatever future existed between them would need to be built slowly, deliberately, through continued demonstration, rather than assumed through old bonds already once broken so thoroughly. As evening settled over the battlefield, both territories began the careful process of recovery and reorganization, following the day's intense confrontation. The immediate threat Garrick's desperate final gambit had posed, now thoroughly resolved, though the deeper questions regarding what remained unresolved between Rain and Damien personally continued lingering, unanswered but no longer entirely without hope. In the quiet aftermath of battle, successfully survive together. 3 days after the battle, word reached Rain's camp that Garrick himself had been located, attempting to flee the region entirely, following news of the coalition's decisive defeat. Blackwood scouts, alerted to his likely escape routes through careful coordination with Rain's own tracking teams, intercepted him just before he could cross into territory beyond either faction's reach. Damien traveled personally to oversee Garrick's return to Blackwood territory, understanding the significance of ensuring the disgraced elder faced full accountability rather than disappearing into obscurity, the way his decades of careful manipulation had once ensured others would. Rain, informed of the successful capture, chose to travel to Blackwood herself for the formal proceedings that would finally determine Garrick's ultimate fate, understanding that her presence carried significance beyond simple diplomatic courtesy, given everything his manipulation had cost her personally. The formal tribunal convened in Blackwood's Great Hall 3 days later, filled once again to capacity, though this time the assembled crowd included representatives from Rain's alliance as well, witnesses to proceedings that carried significance extending well beyond Blackwood's internal pack politics alone. Garrick stood before the assembled crowd, stripped of his former dignity and composure, the desperate flight and subsequent capture having worn away whatever careful mask he had maintained throughout decades of hidden manipulation. When Rain entered the hall, taking her position among the witnesses, his eyes met hers briefly, something unreadable passing across his expression before he looked away entirely. "You have heard the full evidence against you," Damien said, addressing Garrick directly before the assembled crowd. Decades of deliberate manipulation targeting innocent pack members, culminating in an alliance with hostile coalition forces that resulted in direct violence against neighboring territory. What do you have to say in your own defense? Garrick remained silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the careful, calculated confidence that had characterized his decades of influence within Blackwood. "I believed, genuinely believed, that my actions served this pack's greater stability," he said quietly. "Perhaps that belief was ultimately mistaken, shaped more by my own fear of losing relevance and influence than by genuine concern for Blackwood's welfare. I offer no further defense beyond that admission." The hall remained silent following his words, the weight of genuine, if belated acknowledgement settling over the assembled crowd. Damien studied the elder who had once guided so many crucial decisions throughout his own development as future alpha, feeling a complicated mixture of lingering anger and something almost like sorrow at witnessing the complete collapse of influence that had once seemed unshakable. "Garrick," Damien said finally, "you are formally stripped of all standing within Blackwood territory, effective permanently. You are banished from these lands, forbidden from ever returning under any circumstances. Given the scope of harm you have caused across multiple territories, this tribunal further recommends that formal notice be circulated throughout the region, ensuring no other pack unknowingly grants you the trust and influence you so thoroughly betrayed here." The sentence, delivered with the same formal weight Garrick himself had once used to condemn Elena 7 years earlier, carried a symmetry that did not escape anyone present in the hall that day, least of all Rain, who watched the proceedings with complicated emotions she had not fully anticipated experiencing. As guards moved to escort Garrick from the hall for the final time, he paused briefly near where Rain stood among the assembled witnesses, studying her with an expression that seemed to search for something, perhaps some acknowledgement or reaction he could carry with him into whatever uncertain future his banishment now guaranteed. "I do not expect your forgiveness," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear clearly, amid the hall's tense silence. "But know that whatever satisfaction you find in today's proceedings, the strength you now possess, the alliance you have built, none of it would exist without the very suppression I once imposed upon you. Perhaps, in some strange way, my actions ultimately created exactly the outcome I most feared." Rain studied him for a long moment, old grief and hard-won strength mingling within her steady gaze. "You suppressed my abilities to protect your own influence," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "Whatever strength I have built since then exists entirely because I refused to remain broken by what you did to me, not because of any strategic wisdom on your part. Do not mistake my survival for validation of your cruelty." Garrick had no response to offer, and moments later, the guards escorted him from the hall permanently, his decades of careful, hidden manipulation finally, definitively concluded. The hall slowly emptied following his departure, pack members and allied representatives alike processing the weight of proceedings that had finally brought closure to manipulation spanning nearly 3 decades. Rain remained behind briefly, standing quietly amid the gradually thinning crowd, feeling something complicated settling into place within her chest. Not quite relief, not quite closure, but something adjacent to both. Damien found her there several minutes later, the formal proceedings concluded, the hall now nearly empty save for a few remaining staff clearing away the tribunal's ceremonial arrangements. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly, genuine concern coloring his voice. Rain considered the question carefully before answering. "Lighter, somehow," she said finally. "I spent 7 years wondering whether I would ever see genuine accountability for what happened to me. Today, watching that accountability finally realized, I find myself surprised by how much space it opens up. Space I did not realize I had been holding closed against precisely this kind of resolution." "What will you do with that space?" Damien asked. Rain considered the question for a long moment, watching afternoon light filter through the hall's tall windows, illuminating dust motes drifting slowly through the quiet air. "I am not entirely certain yet," she admitted. "But for the first time since I left Blackwood 7 years ago, I find myself genuinely curious to discover the answer, rather than simply focused on survival or strategic necessity alone." Damien studied her carefully, something hopeful flickering behind his own careful composure. "I would like to be part of discovering that answer alongside you," he said quietly, "if you are willing to allow that possibility, even tentatively." Rain met his gaze steadily. 7 years of accumulated grief, finally beginning to settle into something considerably more manageable, considerably more open to whatever possibilities the future might genuinely hold. "Perhaps," she said finally, allowing herself the smallest, genuine smile she had offered him since their unexpected reunion weeks earlier. "But Damien, whatever we build from here, it will need to be built as equals, on my terms as much as yours. I am no longer the Omega you once dismissed so easily. I do not intend to become anyone's convenient afterthought ever again. I would not want you to be anything other than exactly who you have become," Damien said sincerely. "That woman, the one who built an entire alliance from nothing, who faced down every obstacle placed before her with unshakable determination. She is considerably more remarkable than anyone Blackwood ever recognized or deserved during your years here previously." Rain studied him for a long moment, weighing 7 years of grief against the genuine possibility now unfolding before her, before finally nodding, accepting, at least tentatively, the fragile beginning of whatever new understanding might eventually grow between them, built this time on foundations considerably more honest and equal than anything that had existed between them 7 years earlier. 6 months passed following Garrick's formal banishment, months during which Blackwood Territory and Rain's alliance continued deepening their cooperation, coordinating trade routes, sharing defensive resources, and gradually building the kind of genuine trust that had seemed impossible during those first tense negotiations following Rain's unexpected reappearance. Damien visited her camp regularly during this period, and Rain, in turn, began accepting occasional invitations to Blackwood Territory itself, tentatively rebuilding connection to a place that had once represented nothing but painful memory. The change within Blackwood Territory during those months proved considerable. With Garrick's manipulative influence permanently removed, Damien's leadership steadily regained the stability and strength his father had once built. Alliances that had withdrawn support in recent years, slowly returning, as word spread of the genuine reforms taking place. Reforms that included formal policies protecting pack members from exactly the kind of hidden manipulation that had shaped Elena's entire childhood. Rain's own alliance continued flourishing as well, additional territories joining steadily as her reputation for fair, strategic leadership continued spreading throughout the region. What had begun as a small, desperate act of survival following her banishment had grown into a genuine regional power, respected and increasingly influential across territories that had once operated in fractured, competing isolation, before her steady, patient leadership brought them together under shared purpose. It was during a formal gathering marking the Alliance's 3rd anniversary, held in the same wide clearing where the title Rival Queen had first been formally spoken years earlier, that Damien approached Rain with a proposal he had clearly been considering carefully for some time. "I have spent these past months watching 2 territories that once stood as adversaries, then reluctant allies, gradually become something considerably more integrated, he said, finding her at the edge of the celebration, watching the gathered crowd with quiet satisfaction. I believe the time has come to consider something more formal, a genuine merger of our territories, built on the foundation of equality and mutual respect we have worked to establish over these past months. Rain considered the proposal carefully, understanding immediately the significance of what he was suggesting. A merger, she repeated slowly. Under what terms exactly? Not the terms Blackwood tradition once demanded, Damien clarified quickly. Not a mate bond that places you beneath my authority as alpha, and not any arrangement that diminishes what you have built here through your own considerable effort and sacrifice. I am proposing something Blackwood has never attempted before. Joint leadership between two equal territories, each maintaining independent authority over internal matters, while formally uniting for mutual defense, trade, and regional influence. The proposal, considerably more thoughtful than Rain had initially expected, gave her genuine pause. She studied Damien carefully, searching for any trace of the presumptuous authority that had once characterized his approach to their relationship 7 years earlier, and found instead genuine humility, a clear understanding that whatever partnership existed between them now required foundations entirely different from anything Blackwood tradition had previously recognized. You understand, she said carefully, that accepting this proposal does not mean returning to the role Blackwood once assigned me. I will not become simply your Luna, quietly supporting decisions made primarily by Blackwood's leadership. If we merge our territories, I retain full authority over the alliance I built, exactly as you retain authority over Blackwood's internal governance. That is precisely what I am proposing, Damien confirmed. Two sovereign leaders, equally respected, equally authoritative, choosing partnership because it strengthens both territories genuinely, not because tradition or fate demands submission from either side. Rain considered this seriously, weighing 7 years of hard-won independence against the genuine possibility of building something new, something that honored both the strength she had cultivated entirely through her own effort and the reformed, considerably more equitable leadership Damien had demonstrated consistently throughout these past months of careful, deliberate rebuilding. I need time to consider this properly, she said finally, not because I doubt your sincerity, Damien, but because whatever decision I make regarding our territory's future must be made deliberately, with full consideration of everyone who has trusted my leadership throughout these past 3 years. Damien nodded, understanding and respecting the careful consideration she required. Take whatever time you need, he said. I have learned, perhaps later than I should have, that genuine partnership cannot be rushed or assumed. Whatever answer you eventually offer, I will respect it completely. Rain spent the following weeks in careful consultation with her closest advisors, discussing the proposal thoroughly with Priya and Corvin, weighing the practical benefits of formal alliance against her own hard-won independence, and the genuine trust her allied territories had placed in her singular leadership. You have built something remarkable here, Corvin told her during one such conversation, sitting once again by the familiar fire pit at his old camp, where her transformation had first begun 3 years earlier. The question is not whether Damien's proposal offers genuine value, but whether accepting it aligns with the person you have deliberately, carefully become, since that night you walked away from Blackwood's gathering fire. And what do you believe? Rain asked. Corvin considered the question seriously before answering. I believe you are no longer the frightened girl who once needed someone else's approval to understand her own worth. Whatever decision you ultimately make, it will be made from strength rather than desperation, and that difference matters considerably more than the specific terms of any particular agreement. Rain absorbed his words carefully, understanding the deeper truth underlying his careful guidance. Whatever she decided regarding Damien's proposal, the decision itself represented something profoundly different from the powerless circumstances that had once defined her relationship to Blackwood territory entirely. Weeks later, she returned to Blackwood territory to deliver her formal answer, finding Damien waiting in the same great hall where their painful reunion had first taken place months earlier, though the space now carried considerably different weight, transformed by everything that had unfolded since that initial, shocking encounter. I have considered your proposal thoroughly, Rain said, standing before him with the same calm, composed authority that had characterized her leadership throughout the Alliance's 3 years of steady growth. and I am prepared to offer my answer." Damien waited, genuine uncertainty visible beneath his careful composure, understanding that whatever she decided would fundamentally shape the future relationship between their territories, and perhaps between them personally as well. "I accept," Rain said finally, "under the terms you proposed." Two sovereign territories, formally united for mutual benefit and defense, each maintaining complete authority over internal governance. Not Blackwood absorbing my alliance, and not my alliance replacing Blackwood's established structure, but something genuinely new, built on foundations neither territory has previously attempted. Relief and genuine happiness flooded across Damien's expression, though he maintained enough composure to respond formally. Understanding the significance of the moment required appropriate dignity. "Then let us begin building that new foundation properly," he said, "together, as equals, exactly as you have insisted from the beginning." The formal ceremony marking the merger took place 1 month later, in the same neutral hall where their painful renegotiation had first occurred, though this time the gathered crowd included representatives from every territory now formally united under the new arrangement, celebrating rather than negotiating with wary uncertainty. Rain stood at the center of the hall, no longer the frightened, humiliated Omega who had once been cast aside so carelessly, but the rival queen the territories had rightfully named her, standing as an equal partner beside the very alpha who had once discarded her, their combined territories now representing one of the most stable and influential regional powers the area had witnessed in generations. 7 years ago, she said, addressing the assembled crowd with the same calm authority that had guided her through every major challenge since that devastating night, "I was told I was worthless, that my presence brought only weakness rather than strength. Today, I stand before you as proof that worth is never truly determined by those who choose to dismiss it, but by what we ourselves choose to build in response to that dismissal." The crowd's response was immediate and enthusiastic, generations of accumulated tradition finally giving way to something genuinely new, a partnership built not on inherited authority or assumed submission, but on demonstrated strength, mutual respect, and the hard-won understanding that true leadership required considerably more than simple bloodline or title alone. As the celebration continued late into the evening, Rain found herself standing once more at the edge of a gathering, watching territories that had once existed in painful, fractured isolation, now moving together, with genuine warmth and shared purpose. Damien found her there, offering a quiet smile that carried none of the presumptuous authority that had once characterized his approach toward her, but something considerably more genuine, considerably more earned. "How does it feel?" he asked, "standing here now, considering everything that brought us to this moment?" Rain considered the question carefully, looking out over the celebrating crowd, feeling 7 years of grief, 3 years of relentless transformation, and months of careful, deliberate rebuilding, finally converge into something she had never quite dared imagine possible during those early, desperate days following her banishment. "It feels," she said finally, "like exactly what I always deserved, though it took considerable time and effort to build it myself, rather than simply waiting for someone else to recognize it on my behalf." Damien nodded, understanding fully the weight and truth of her words. "Then, let us continue building it together," he said, "for as long as you are willing to allow that partnership to continue." Rain looked out over the United Territories, celebrating together beneath the evening sky, feeling the last remnants of the frightened, discarded girl she had once been finally, completely settle into the powerful, self-made queen she had become entirely, through her own strength, determination, and unwavering refusal to accept anyone else's judgment of her worth. "For as long as it continues to be built honestly," she said, "as equals, exactly as it should have been from the very beginning." And beneath the warm glow of celebration fires burning steadily into the night, two territories once divided by careless cruelty and decades of hidden manipulation stood united at last, not through fate or forced submission, but through genuine strength, hard-won respect, and the unshakable resilience of a woman who had refused, against every obstacle placed before her, to remain broken by those who had once, so wrongly, called her worthless.